What does it mean to call something routine when the canvas on which that routine is painted is an entire, uncharted sweep of the Milky Way? That question hangs like a faint radio tone in the opening minutes of every mission brief. It is not rhetorical. It is the image that prefaces the manifest, a grid of sterile coordinates, a mission patch flanked by agency seals, and a clause that reads like polite violence. Exploration of unmapped sectors, identification of potentially habitable exoplanets. On paper, this is a line item in a decade-long program. In reality, it is an agreement to spend years moving through the quiet between stars, sampling for the rare intersections of rock, light, chemistry, and the mission begins with a series of gestures that have, over generations of interstellar travel, become ritualized into a choreography meant to domesticate anxiety. Panels are cross-checked in triplicate. Redundant power buses are toggled and logged. A soft mechanical voice announces system status in tones calibrated to calm the human ear, suit seals nominal, habitats pressurizing, fusion outputs balanced. Minutes fold into one another in a way that feels both endless and finite. The checklist becomes a collective mantra, a way to keep the mind from wandering into the vastness it will soon traverse. Yet routine, in this context, is an uneasy peace between monotony and the constant probability of the unprecedented. The crew. If the word means anything more than a functional arrangement of skills and hours, are selected for a particular temperament. They are people who can translate solitude into concentration, who can turn the hum of climate control into a metronome that keeps their circadian rhythms from unspooling. They arrive at the vessel with histories compressed, spouses, parents, small gardens left with automatons, children who will age a decade in the time it takes to reach the next candidate system. There is a public narrative that frames the expedition, scientific imperative, survival contingency, the metaphysical impulse to know whether life can take root elsewhere. But there is also the private anatomy of routine tiny rituals that become anchors. A particular mug that always returns to the same shelf in the galley. A sequence of stretches performed at the beginning of every 6-hour watch. A night shift that will always listen for the pattern of stationary stars passing on a particular monitor. The pattern is a lullaby as well as an alarm. Technically, what the mission is tasked with is straightforward. Sweep an uncharted region, gather high-resolution spectra of candidate worlds, map planetary radii and atmospheres, and analyze for biosignatures, oxygen imbalance, methane cycles, seasonal variability that suggests complex cycles of life. The instruments are exacting in their hunger. They peer into the faint glow of exoplanetary atmospheres and decode chemical whispers into hypotheses. A spectrometer cannot be awed. It reads photons and returns numbers. For the humans orchestrating the instruments, though the early months of the voyage are devoted to establishing pattern. Space agencies call it calibration and acclimation. The ship, newly cleaned and polished, hosts a choreography of maintenance checks that are both mundane and existential. The hull is scanned for micrometeoroid pitting. Radiators are inspected as though their surface could betray the birthmark of future catastrophe. Data pipelines are stress-tested until the act itself becomes a ritual. These procedures do not simply ensure system integrity, they construct a measure of predictability in an unpredictable environment. To keep emotion in these circumstances does not erupt in dramatic displays, so much as it ossifies into patterns of attention. There is a tendency to flatten feeling into competence. Anxiety becomes meticulousness, nausea becomes rearrangement of stowage, homesickness becomes exhaustive documentation of flora on comms to ground. The crew's interior lives are not private so much as repurposed. Time is sliced into watches, reports, and maintenance shifts. The subjective experience of days becomes a ledger of tasks completed. Yet between those ledger lines are moments of unbidden wonder. A long communication with mission control is a choreography of latency and formality. Messages are concise, with standard headers and confirmations. The language is almost designed to remove ambiguity, because ambiguity in the void can metastasize into disaster. These exchanges are not dramatic, they are functional, containing codes and timestamps and the occasional brief note of encouragement. Status nominal. Keep the cadence that serve more as psychological ballast than as necessary information. The delay between transmission and acknowledgement is a lesson in patience. Sending routine also absorbs aesthetics. The ship's architecture is not heroic, it is efficient. Corridors are lined with instrument racks, metric displays blink with a subdued luminescence, and the galley offers food engineered for nutritional density rather than pleasure. Still, humans have a way of layering beauty onto necessity. A plant module, no larger than a trunk, becomes a shrine to perseverance. Its cultivated herbs are measured for growth rates in lab notebooks and also touched with a tenderness that is not strictly scientific. Small artifacts, preserved photographs, and yet the mission is not simply about endurance. It is projective, a search. Instruments are periodically reoriented, telescopes slewing across star fields in long, deliberate arcs. The crew trains on systems that can assess a planet's energy budget, that can infer the presence of oceans from reflected light, that can detect atmospheric disequilibria. The process by which a world is woven from data is almost poetic. A spectrum's subtle lines, the narrow dimples and peaks where photons are absorbed by molecules, become a story about atmospheres, climate, and perhaps biology. There is a particular humility to this work. In many ways, searching for another habitable planet is less about discovery than about refinement, narrowing the candidate list from billions to a handful, then from a handful to one or two, and always recognizing that certainty is a gradient that rarely reaches absolute. The crew learns to be patient with ambiguity. They learn that the universe confers no narrative on their timeline, it only offers signals and probabilities. That patience is its own discipline, cultivated with a mixture of boredom and reverence. In the quiet of the observation bay, where arrays breathe and readouts pulse like a city at night, the sense of smallness becomes acute. The couple of racks that constitute the ship's science core link them to centuries of thought, orbital mechanics, spectroscopy, the slow accretion of knowledge that allowed humans to peer outward. The crew carries, sometimes implicitly and sometimes explicitly, the burden of that history. There is a generational weight to the work, the sense that, if successful, the mission will add a single datum to humanity's cosmic ledger, and that datum may, centuries from now, be a hinge in someone's origin story. Routine, however, is not merely an aesthetic or logistical choice, it is a survival strategy. The human brain is not designed for decades-long anticipatory suspense. If every day were fraught with existential decision, the mission could not sustain itself. So rituals arise, a daily briefing that lasts no more than 15 minutes, a communal exercise regimen timed to the ship's gravity simulation, quiet hours to allow rest cycles. These intervals create a rhythm, and the rhythm protects the mission's cognitive capital. Even the way bad news is transmitted follows protocol. Anomalies are but routine can also conceal. A steady cadence can lull observation into complacency. It is in the dull repetition of checks that small deviations, an instrument that records a slightly different baseline, a sensor that lags by a fraction of a second may be overlooked. The danger lies not in the existence of routine, but in the human tendency to mistake sameness for safety. For that reason, the mission deliberately institutes redundancy not only in hardware, but in perspective. Teams are rotated, analyses are cross-checked, different algorithms are run in parallel. The formal culture on board, the emotional texture of the mission is a study in contrasts. There are moments of crystalline clarity when a new dataset resolves a long-standing ambiguity and the hull of the ship seems to vibrate with a sudden shared elation. There are other moments thick with dread, reports of a microfracture on an auxiliary hull, a warning light that refuses to go quiet. These spikes of feeling are always absorbed into the quotidian, They become items on a dispatch, entries in a log. Still, beneath the procedural surface, the crew's private histories keep exerting gravitational force. There are letters read in quiet corners and the documentary perspective attends to such details, not as mere color, but as evidence of a more profound truth. Exploration is a human activity that cannot be extricated from human life. The search for a habitable planet is as much about recalibrating human time as it is about astrophysical measurement. The rhythms of a child's adolescence, the arc of a family's grief, a scientist's lifetime of speculation, these temporalities are folded together in the narrow confines of the vessel. In this way, the mission becomes a small theatre in which and yet, despite the magnitude of the question, much of the mission's drama is orthogonal to the eventual answer. The vast bulk of the voyage will be an accumulation of tiny judgments, modest corrections, repetitive maintenance, and the patient shaping of instruments toward ever more precise resolutions. There is a particular kind of heroism in that patience, in the willingness to live days composed of micro-decisions that together maintain the possibility of revelation. This is not the heroic tableau of myth. It is a less glamorous, more authentic courage, the capacity to an external observer, this might seem like an anticlimax, a constellation of small, unglamorous acts adverted to the grand sweep of exploration. But there is a narrative richness in that anticlimax. It reveals the real architecture of exploration, not as sudden discovery, but as the slow telescoping of probability. Not as the climactic unveiling, but as the patient coaxing of a signal from noise. The ability to endure, to refine, to anticipate, and to carry memory across light years is at once a technical and a moral undertaking. As the mission garlands itself in its early cycles of checks and calibrations, occasional anomalies will appear, tiny, almost insignificant deviations that feed the imagination. A spectral line that seems slightly broader than models predict, a phase curve with a faint inflection, a thermal mapping that shows patchy infrared emission inconsistent with a dry, inert surface. The procedural reaction is always the same: log, verify, repeat. Yet these anomalies, even when explained, seed the mind with possibilities. They are the first, delicate tendrils of a story that may or may not unfold. The mission's public narrative, as framed by agencies and summarized for press briefings, will emphasize its routine nature, a responsible, methodical sweep through a sector of the galaxy. That language serves a social function. It calms stakeholders, channels funding, and frames expectations. But the documentary eye recognizes that within that routine lie layers of tension and longing. Routine does not preclude wonder, it facilitates it. By organizing the great uncertainty into manageable patterns, routine makes possible the attentive gaze that could, one day, detect the faint chemical. In the ship's log, which reads like the margins of a longer human story, entries will alternate between the banal and the poignant. Radiator efficiency within green. Repaired micrometeoroid pitting on port 3B. Later, data pipeline restored. Received message from family. Birthday cakes in the 0G kitchen. Even later, anomaly detected in spectral dataset at coordinates 12,000, 17,004. Preliminary analysis pending. These lines, dry in style, are rich in implication. Hence, the opening of this particular mission is a study in the ordinary elevated to necessity. It is not dramatic in the way of a novel's opening salvo, rather it is documentary in the sense that it attends to fact while being cognizant of feeling. There is no romance imposed on the facts, instead their quiet resonance is allowed to emerge. The crew, the ship, and the mission are presented as instruments of attention machines and people arranged to listen to the galaxy's faint signals. Routine, then, is both shelter and risk. It shelters by providing structure in a setting where unpredictability is the default. It risks complacency if it calcifies into blind repetition. The mission's success depends on maintaining that tension, on using routine to keep alive the capacity for wonder and the rigor to interpret it. The humble, repeated acts of maintenance and observation are not a lesser form of exploration. They are the essential work that preserves curiosity long enough for the universe to answer. In the quiet moments between the checklists and the calibrations, an image persists. The ship, a modest technology adrift against a cathedral of stars, small and temporary and utterly sincere in its task. To call the mission routine is to name the way humans have domesticated their anxiety about the vastness beyond. It is to admit that exploration is not only discovery, but discipline. That the human search for a home among the stars is a project of enduring attention. And in that endurance lies the fragile hope that one day a faint set of spectral lines will pull the entire enterprise into a new orbit. What is the experience of encountering a planet that was not supposed to exist on any chart? An unexpected world that arrives not as revelation, but as a perturbation in a long, well-practiced routine. That question arrives first, as a cold, clinical hook. The mission had been designed to find the anticipated, to sweep catalogued probabilities. The unexpected is noisier. It forces an entire system, machines, procedures, and the quiet human attention that runs them, to reconfigure itself at once. The detection begins as an almost trivial line on an instrument output, a blip that lives at the margins of statistical noise. A radar ping returns with a profile that does not match background clutter. An automated handler flags it, and the flag propagates through the ship's orchestration. The alert is not drama so much as a change of tempo, a tightening of processes, the rerouting of attention. A camera bank is brought to bear. A spectrometer is tasked with a preliminary sweep. The long arc of the mission that had been comfortable in its predictability bends toward the unknown. When the first image resolves on the observation array, it is the sort of moment that resists heroic language and yet demands it. On a screen, more accustomed to lines of digits and spectral plots, color appears. A deep, attenuated blue of oceans and the matte greens and ochres of emergent landmasses. The composition is uncannily familiar, an expanse of water that mirrors the depth and breadth of an early Earth, continents arranged in sprawling plates rather than neat, humanly legible borders. It is a planet that might have been caught in a geological adolescence when seas draped the crust and the atmospheric chemistry. The camera does not speak. It streams photons, each one carrying a little history of reflection and absorption, and those photons are translated by algorithms into an image that the human eye can comprehend. But in that translation, the crew understood here as a diffuse set of attention and expertise distributed across the ship reads more than pixels. They read suggestion, possibility, and risk. The sensor suite provides corroboration. A thermal map shows latitudinal gradients. Infrared channels imply active weather systems. Polar caps, if present, are modest. Cloud deck. For a species that has long told itself origin stories of blue worlds, the visual echo is disorienting. A cognitive consonance forms between the image and the repository of knowledge about how planets age, about the interplay of oceans and atmosphere, and the slow choreography of tectonics. Yet the image resists a neat narrative. There is no immediate evidence of complex life, but the planet's palette suggests a chemistry that could sustain it, sufficient water, an atmosphere thick enough to bend light into the characteristic coastal blues, and surface heterogeneity that implies ongoing geological. The approach protocol unfolds as choreography rather than improvisation. Cameras narrow their field of view, exposures lengthen, and a sequence of wavelengths is prioritized, visible for morphology, near-infrared for vegetation, like reflectance, mid-infrared for thermal processes, and ultraviolet to probe atmospheric scattering and potential ozone-like absorption. Spectrometers, disciplined workhorses of inference, take long, slow listens to the planet's light. They resolve the faint imprints of molecules, lines and troughs in a sea of noise that will become hypotheses about composition. Each instrument's report is a fragment. It will take integration, reduction. The ship's automated systems perform much of this initial synthesis, but it is the human-oriented interpretive layer that brings psychological weight to the data. There is a familiar tension. Professionals trained to treat anomalies with skepticism must also allow themselves the room to be surprised. The documentary lens records that tension in the form of ritualized verification. Data are reprocessed using a battery of pipelines. Different teams apply distinct models. Edge cases are fed to older algorithms to check for algorithmic bias. The result is not a drama of discoveries, but a slowly narrowing. As resolution increases, outlines of coastlines emerge. They are not sharp as a modern satellite image. They are textured, broad, brushed, geologic in their impermanence. Shallow continental shelves betray themselves through spectral signatures, a scattering indicative of suspended sediments and maybe biological mats close to shore. There are sequences of curvilinear bays and arcuate chains of islands that hint at tectonic edges and volcanic arcs. In what would be a lifetime on a home planet, these features might bear the physical scars of epochs, long-vanished shorelines, where the dynamics become legible in motion. A cyclonic swirl tightens near a mid-latitude boundary. Equatorial cloud bands suggest an atmospheric circulation that is both energetic and potentially stabilizing. The thermal gradient between sea and land is punctuated by warm eddies and cooler upwellings, subtle signs that the ocean is not a static sheet but a dynamic engine of climate. These processes, in aggregate, increase the probability that the planet maintains a stable climate over geological epochs. Stability, in cosmological terms, is not continuity, but the capacity to absorb perturbation. One of the most consequential early signals is not an image at all, but the whisper of magnetism. Magnetometers detect a regular, planet-scale magnetic field, its presence inferred by the magnetotail interacting with the ambient plasma and by subtle modulations in charged particle flux. A magnetic dynamo suggests a molten convecting core and, critically, a shield against stellar wind erosion. Without it, an atmosphere can be stripped over geologic time. With it, the planet preserves the conditions necessary for complex chemistry at its surface. This shift is not merely scientific. A different kind of attention settles over the mission's architecture. Time budgets are recalculated, data downlink priorities are reprioritized, observation windows are negotiated against previously scheduled sweeps. The ship is a machine that must balance curiosity against fuel, bandwidth against redundancy. Each decision to linger longer, to refine a measurement, is an ethical and logistical act. It commits resources that could be spent elsewhere. The documentary narrator notes such decisions not to dramatize them, but to record them as evidence of how speculation, careful and disciplined, begins to fill margins. If the planet is early, Earth-like, what else could be true? Could surfaces bear the marks of ancient biogeochemical cycles? Stromatolitic mats at shallow margins, oxygen transients in the atmosphere, or carbon burial patterns that leave isotopic fingerprints? These are not immediate claims, they are pathways for inquiry. The suite of follow-up observations is designed to test such pathways. Time series photometry to detect seasonal albedo variations, high-resolution spectroscopy to seek disequilibria. There is also the unavoidable human tendency to imagine traces of technology. The documentary voice treats such imaginings with a double-edged patience. On the one hand, the concept of a civilization erased by plate tectonics and time is alluring. On the other, it is constrained by the realities of geological erasure. Deep time is indifferent. The redistribution of crust, the cyclical recycling via subduction, and the abrasive work of erosion are all efficient agents of oblivion. What little may remain of a technological species on a planet with active tectonics If there were to be signs, the search would be for signatures that resist rapid geological wiping, non-natural isotopic ratios in surface metals, planar geometries in mineral deposits, inconsistent with natural formation, energy use patterns detectable through anomalously concentrated thermal outputs, or artificial electromagnetic emissions that defy known natural spectra. Each of these is, in documentary terms, a slender reed of possibility. Plausible perhaps, but demanding of rigorous skepticism. The mission's analytic apparatus is therefore tuned not for sensational confirmation, but for conserve. As the ship draws nearer, observational modalities expand. Passive imaging continues, but active sensing, radar pulses to infer near-surface roughness and scattering, LiDAR to gauge atmospheric particulates and cloud-based heights, microwave radiometry to penetrate cloud cover and sample lower atmosphere temperatures comes online. These datasets, unlike the early visual impressions, are less vulnerable to interpretational illusion. Together, they construct a three-dimensional sense of the planet, surface topography, atmospheric stratification, and throughout these technical maneuvers, the mission's psychological environment hums with a peculiar strain of expectation. Attention becomes a currency. The crew, construed again as a shifting constellation of competencies, feel the prolongation of routine fold into a rarefied attention span. Where once chores and maintenance dominated, now the day is punctuated by bursts of urgent synthesis and long stretches of careful waiting while instruments integrate. This rhythm is quiet and profound, not cinematic in the immediate sense, but charged with a patient intensity that accumulates like sediment. The possibility that this planet might be a second data point in a cosmic pattern weighs on institutional memory. If the planet's chemicals hint at a pathway to life similar to Earth's, it could revise probabilities that underpin entire branches of astrobiology. Conversely, if the world is a closed experiment in habitability that nonetheless failed to produce life, that too would sharpen theoretical models about contingency and convergence. The stake is not merely whether life exists there, it is about refining the grammar by which life is possible in the universe. The documentary lens lingers on smaller human-scale artifacts of this process. Time-stamped logs proliferate, automated headers record instrument health and orientation, quality assurance notes flag data segments, archived image tiles are labeled with metadata that future scientists will consult. These dry entries are the scaffolding of future stories. They will be mined by historians, policymakers, and perhaps even distant descendants, seeking the lineage of a decision to stay an hour longer, to take a spectrum at a slightly different phase angle. Still, despite all the instrumentality, wonder is not banished. A long exposure image of the planet's limb captures the faint scatter of an auroral arc, a green-blue filament dancing in the upper atmosphere that hints at charged particles and a responsive magnetosphere. It is an ephemeral flourish, physically inconsequential to immediate measurements, but symbolically rich, a planetary-scale interplay between star and shield, energy and climate, chance and stability. Such images become icons in the internal narrative of the mission tools for public engagement certainly, but also private lodestone. Approach culminates, at least for now, not in resolution of the central question, but in the opening of a new chapter of investigation. The planet is catalogued, its approximate orbit established, its basic habitability parameters assessed with cautious optimism. Commitments are made to study it in greater detail, to map it over different phases, to send remote probes perhaps, and to allocate bandwidth to continuous monitoring. Each commitment alters the mission's geometry, reassigning attention and resources into a telescoped future. The narrator, with an omniscient patience, records how the moment changes more than just the mission's itinerary. It alters the human relation to contingency. The discovery is not a single point, but a cascade of small reconfigurations, operational, epistemic, and affective. The planet's image, once a mere anomaly on a radar return, becomes a locus around which human thought reorganizes. An imagined landscape of possible histories, of lost and emergent ecologies, and of the slow, impartial work of geological change. In the face of that, what comes next is procedural, closer passes, refined spectrometry, campaign planning. But what the documentary voice seeks to emphasize is less the sequence of steps than the transformed attention that will carry them out. The mission has not found an answer. It has found a question with gravity, one that will pull resources and thought toward it as surely as a planet bends passing light. To approach such a world is to practice a new kind of listening, attentive, skeptical, patient, and to carry forward, in the thin pages of logs and the careful arcs of instruments, the modest human what would it mean, in the long arithmetic of cosmic possibility, to read oxygen in a distant sky and find it strikingly familiar? An atmosphere whose chemical breath mirrors the one that made human life possible. That question arrived first as a number, then as a tone that shifted the ship's attention. Spectra that had been routine columns of data suddenly cohered into something with moral force. The telltale absorption features of molecular oxygen, their depths and ratios implying a fractional concentration close to the 21% that the human lungs had known for millennia. It was not merely the presence of oxygen that startled, but the steadiness of it. An atmospheric composition that was not a trace, not a transient spike, but a sustained, globally significant balance. In the sterile lexicon of instrumentation, the detection method was itself an old story of light and inference. Sunlight reflected off the planet carried with it imprints of the gases it had traversed, narrow bands of diminished intensity where molecules had selectively removed photons. The oxygen A band, around 760 nanometers, had been sought for decades as a plausible biosignature. Here, that band was robust. The ratio of its fine structure lines matched models of a well-mixed atmosphere. Complementary signals, ozone absorption in the ultraviolet, the relative paucity of reduced gases that would consume free oxygen painted a picture consistent with why that mattered required a brief reckoning with chemical time. Oxygen is, chemically, a social molecule. It reacts readily, binds with metal and carbon, and leaves little unclaimed if left to pure chemistry. On a geologically active world, oxygen will be consumed unless replenished. In the absence of continuous production, either by ongoing photochemistry under unique stellar conditions, or more plausibly, by sustained biological processes, high concentrations of atmospheric oxygen do not endure. Thus, the initial reaction was not joy so much as recalibration. Caution-tempered wonder. Instruments were fallible, models incomplete. Abiotic pathways exist. Hydrodynamic escape can leave oxygen, if hydrogen preferentially escapes after water. Photolysis, certain mineralogy can liberate and sustain oxidants under peculiar conditions. Ultraviolet flux and atmospheric composition can drive seemingly biological signatures in rare cases. The scientific apparatus moved into its methodical defense posture, multiple spectral instruments, different bands, independent pipelines, and temporally separated observations to discount flukes. But as data accumulated, the pattern held. One set of implications was immediate and practical. An oxygen-rich atmosphere increases the odds of habitability as defined by terrestrial experience. A temperate climate, moderated by buffering gases, potential for complex energy gradients exploited by life, and chemical disequilibria that fuel metabolic pathways. For exploration, it altered priorities. Observation time, data bandwidth, and the allotment of remote sensing modes were redirected. What had been a sweep became a study, and the arithmetic of research then, as the ship adjusted its gaze and the catalogued coordinates were revisited with different modalities, another set of data arrived that was harder to reconcile with the quiet, slow-building excitement of a potentially biotic atmosphere. From orbital vectors and high-resolution imaging, a constellation of structures appeared, large, regular, and distributed, hanging outside the planet's denser atmosphere. They were not the caprice of natural geology. Their geometries were modular and repeating. Their alignments suggested systemic placement, not random ejection by impacts. In a solar, to describe them required the language of instruments. Radar tomography returned, echoes inconsistent with porous rock, reflectance spectra showed materials with abrupt discontinuities and narrow emission lines that failed to match the known catalogues of minerals. Polarimetric measurements indicated surfaces engineered to control gleam and scatter. Thermal mapping revealed regions of anomalous heat, localized, structured, and showing temporal variance suggestive of activity. Spatially, the objects formed a lattice of scales, some elements hundreds of meters across, others kilometers, arranged in pattern. Importantly, their orbital dynamics were instructive. Many sat in low, near-atmospheric altitudes where natural bodies would quickly decay. Yet the array maintained station-relative motion not governed by simple Keplerian drift. Perturbations by atmospheric drag implied active station-keeping. The structures adjusted in synchrony, compensating for torque and microdrag in ways that betrayed control systems. Even more telling was the density of arrangement, a network of platforms and tethered volumes that, together, resembled a distributed infrastructure more than debris. If these were the interpretive leap from unnatural geometry to artificial origin is not made lightly in disciplined observation. The documentarian eye that records such moments notes the procedural patience exhibited, multiple instruments revisiting the same targets, different spectral decompositions run in parallel, and models cross-checked against every conceivable natural analogue. Nothing in the data pointed to a transient swarm ejected by some cataclysmic event. Instead, the signatures suggested purpose. An economy of design in which form followed function and speculation, necessarily disciplined, branched into several hypotheses about purpose. The structures could be habitats, orbital stations where atmospheres and life, if present, were sheltered from planetary instability. They might be climate control arrays, shields, reflectors, or dispersers arranged to modulate insolation and manage the delicate balance of a planetary climate. Alternatively, they could be industrial, solar harvesting meshes, manufacturing platforms, or orbital scaffolds for resource extraction and space-based processing, untethered to a single generation's needs. There was also that last notion that orbital artifacts could survive the deep forgetting of surface geology was central to the weight of this discovery. Surface civilizations, when subject to erosion, tectonic recycling, and atmospheric chemistry, leave scant durable signatures over deep time. Stone ruins crumble, organic constructions oxidize and dissolve, isotopic anomalies diffuse and dilute. Space, by contrast, is a preservation medium. In the vacuum above a planet, structures can evade the grinding forces of geology and weather. This reasoning reframed the relationship between the planet's biochemistry and the orbital network. An oxic atmosphere could be the product of long-term biological processes, of ecosystems that moved carbon and hydrogen in rhythms favorable to free oxygen. But equally plausible in imagination was a story in which technological agency had once been the driver, orbital factories that processed volatiles into oxygen, large-scale geoengineering intended to terraform or preserve a biosphere, or maintenance platforms that sustained ecological function. Each scenario posed different expectations for what the mission might find on Earth. The analytic roadmap that followed was rigorous and cautious. Radar interferometry was prioritized to resolve structure topology, LiDAR measured precise altitudes and the outline of external appendages, spectroscopy across ultraviolet to far infrared interrogated material composition and emission lines that indicate engineered alloys or industrial byproducts. Temporal studies sought rhythms, diurnal cycles that might betray energy collection, phased waste heat indicating manufacture, or communications like narrowband emissions. The latter was treated with a special care. Narrowband signal etiquette and ethics migrated into the technical vocabulary. The presence of artifacts raised questions about interference, preservation, and the rights of whatever agency had created them, if agency still existed at all. The default posture in such contexts is restraint, minimizing physical interference, avoiding introducing terrestrial microbes or materials that could confuse future archaeological interpretation, and recognizing that a discovery of this kind transitions a mission from exploration to stewardship. The question is not merely whether the structures are interesting, there were also immediate pragmatic concerns. Orbiting structures, especially those that may be active, posed navigational hazards. Their station-keeping maneuvers might react unpredictably to a close pass. Remote probes promised the best combination of data and safety, but probes consume fuel and bandwidth and could compromise long-term study if lost. Decisions about deployment were no longer purely scientific calculations. They became ethical triage and resource diplomacy across agencies and stakeholder groups. Beneath these operational considerations, the discovery exerted a more profound effect on the narrative arc of the mission. The planet and its orbital constellation transformed the mission's posture from patient cataloger to custodian of a living question about continuity across deep time. The possibility that a technological presence, whether now silent, extinct, or still operating, had chosen orbit as a medium of preservation reframed ideas about where and how civilizations might leave traces. It suggested that the archaeological record of the cosmos, emotion in this context, became a collective texture rather than an individual drama. The record shows a blend of awe and unease, awe at the scale of what was found, and unease at the implications for human understanding of persistence and loss. There was a sharp cognitive dissonance between the intimacy suggested by an oxygen-rich atmosphere, an echo of life's rhythms, and the aloofness of structures that seem to have removed themselves from planetary churn. The juxtaposition raised an elegant, melancholic question about the fate of minds. When civilizations vanished from the ground, what do they choose to? And yet, while the possible narratives proliferated, the documentary voice insisted on the slow, patient constraint of evidence. What the data permitted were no grand proclamations, but a set of increasingly refined probabilities. A planet with a persistent oxidizing atmosphere, a complex of orbital structures exhibiting properties consistent with design, temporal signatures that suggested at least intermittent activity. Each finding was accompanied by caveats, instrumental biases, alternative natural explanations, and the haunting possibility that future, more sensitive observations might invert. The discovery reshaped the mission's broader epistemology. It prompted a reconceptualization of search strategies, not only where life might exist, but where traces of intelligence might be preserved. It highlighted an underappreciated axis of deep time, the preference of some trajectories to move phenomena into environments of slow decay rather than fast preservation. It suggested that to find the past of other minds, one must sometimes look up rather than down. In the margins of technical reports and public briefings, the imagery persisted. Satellite-like shadows traced across cloud decks, lattice frameworks casting feeble glints when the planet's star slid behind them, and thermal filaments that pulsed with a rhythm not yet fully decoded. These were not just data points, they became metaphors for endurance and loss. The structures, speculatively, might be memorials, machines, sanctuaries, or accidents of survival. Their presence against an atmosphere that sang in familiar tones created a paradox, a world that had retained the chemistry as the mission's log accumulated entries, meticulously time-stamped, algorithmically analyzed, and ethically framed. The episode stood as a lesson in humility. The cosmos could carry surprises that reworked categories and demanded new languages of inquiry. Oxygen and artifacts together complicated easy narratives. A habitable planet is not automatically inhabited in the ways one expects. Technological imprints can outlast their makers and present themselves to later seekers as puzzles wrapped in silence. To encounter such evidence is to confront the juxtaposition of continuity and rupture. In the quiet following these revelations, the mission settled into a form of patient attention that had been its original ethos. Instruments continued their long listening, now tuned to different patterns. Models were refined, ethical frameworks were revisited. The discovery did not resolve into a single meaning. Rather, it opened a corridor of inquiry that linked atmospheric chemistry, orbital engineering, and the uneasy archaeology of the sky. The planet's oxygen and the structures above it were not a solution to the cosmic question of whether life is common. They were a new kind of question, one about the forms that life. What remained, and what would endure in the record of this mission, was the image of a world that both breathed like home and wore in its upper reaches the marks of deliberate construction. That double image reframed the human project of exploration, to seek not just habitable worlds, but the traces of choices made across deep time. It reminded observers that the universe keeps records in surprising places, and that reading them requires a patience equal to the ages that shaped them. The discovery offered no immediate answers, only a widened field of possibility. An invitation to listen longer, to look. What does it mean to make the first deliberate impression upon a world that has been keeping its own counsel for an unfathomable stretch of time? That image of a human footprint against a foreign soil, sealed into the archive of geology, serves as a hinge between two modes of time: the slow arithmetic of planetary processes and the urgent, brittle tempo of a mission that counts its days in tasks and transmissions. It is not a scene of melodrama so much as an ethical moment, a question of stewardship disguised as exploration. To step down is to begin a conversation with deep time. To leave the plateau they chose was not a random sweep of terrain. From orbital vectors and remote sensing, it presented as a broad, gently undulating expanse. An elevated plain ringed by low ridges, with a surface texture that read as consolidated fine sediment and weathered basalt. From above, the place had looked hospitable to equipment deployment and offered a clear skyline for communications with the orbiting array of artifacts. That larger architecture, satellites, platforms, lattices hung beyond the immediate airspace like museum objects in a vast, slow planetarium. Many of them, at descent, the craft executed procedures that had become ritualized across generations of interstellar missions, environmental seals verified in nested redundancies, sterilization protocols applied to external sampling gear, telemetry piped through quarantine layers to prevent cross-contamination. The choreography of landing was as much about restraint as it was about placement. To land was to assert the possibility of contact. To overstep protocol was to risk becoming the agent of oblivion. On a planet where ancient hands, if there had once been hands, had chosen to lift structures into orbit, the sky was the immediate aesthetic surprise. It lay broad and clear, but not in the way of an earthly blue. The dominant hue carried a purple cast, a subtle amethyst veil that shifted with solar elevation and the scattering of particulate matter. This chromatic signature could, in the laboratory, be decomposed into likely causes: an atmosphere rich in aerosols with porphyrin-like scattering properties, or a star whose spectral output favored wavelengths that produced unfamiliar scattering curves through Rayleigh and Mie interactions. The purple was not simply cosmetic. It was a chemical. As the ramp descended and the first boots touched the plateau, the instruments began to speak in their own sterile dialect. A suite of ground-penetrating radar swept the immediate radius, resolving strata with millimeter sensitivity. Seismometers, deployed with mechanical care, listened for the planet's internal voice. Microquakes, tectonic settling, or the faint throb of geothermal circulation. Magnetometers sketched the local magnetic field, attentive to variations that would speak to a dynamo's vigor beneath the crust. All of it was recorded, time-stamped, redundantly archived, What the instruments found in the first hours were surprises that were, in their measure, modest and profound. The ground's uppermost horizon contained discontinuities, linear arrays of low-relief features that did not conform to the random grammar of erosional patterns. From certain angles, these ridges suggested foundations, regular spacing, right-angled intersections, alignments with cardinal directions implied by either celestial markers or intentional orientation. There were also reflective anomalies, patches whose spectral reflectance deviated sharply from geologic expectations, returning narrowband light. Crucially, nothing about these signatures allowed for immediate certainty. The documentary posture was to narrate probabilities, to weigh alternatives. Geological processes can produce regular forms, columnar jointing, polygonal cracking, and the ordered tessellation of cooling lavas are all natural architects. Yet the convergence of modular spacing, material discontinuities, and correlation with orbital artifacts overhead pushed the analytic probability toward agency rather than accident. The hypothesis that structures, constructed and arranged, had existed here was now a working explanatory model, but the plateau's silence carried specific acoustics. The thinness of the atmosphere, as measured by pressure sensors, conferred a crispness to sound. Voices, were there any, would carry with clarity but diminished amplitude. Wind was an intermittent presence, sculpting moving ripples across fine-grained surfaces, occasionally lifting dust in puffs that glowed faintly when struck by sunlight filtered through that purple air. There were no vocalizations, no active megastructural hums audible from the surface. But the electromagnetic scene overhead was not empty. The orbiting array continued to whisper in pulses, subtle, low-power beacons that manifested as the presence of such signals generated a cascade of interpretive questions. Were these beacons the last echoes of an erstwhile civilization? Were they automated conservation systems designed to stabilize climate or to protect archives in orbit? Or were they the inert hum of ancient machines, set to recur by design over centennial cycles as a cultural practice of remembrance? Such possibilities are not mutually exclusive. To imagine a species that folded parts of itself into the vacuum-choosing orbit as a refuge from geological erasure, opening a sequestered sample vault on an alien world, is not, in practice, a romantic act. It is a chain of custody operation that treats dirt as potential evidence and contamination as a kind of moral trespass. Samples were taken in nested containment, surface scrapes sealed into vacuum cores, atmospheric intakes passed through multi-stage filters and cryogenic traps, particulate deposits scoured into sterile vials and catalogued with metadata that included precise GPS, orientation, and temporal context. Each sample generated an immediate. The team prioritized non-destructive sensing first. High-resolution spectroscopy of surface reflectance sought compositional fingerprints that would reveal manufactured alloys, glassy vitrifications, or polymeric residues. The spectral library search produced narrow emission lines and absorption features that did not map cleanly onto known geological or biogeochemical signatures. Some materials exhibited metallic-like plasmonic resonances. Others returned unusual polarized scattering, suggestive of engineered microstructures intended to control reflectivity. Thermal mapping disclosed none of this constituted proof. The documentary voice maintained a careful cadence of skepticism alongside wonder. The data invited hypotheses, habitation modules, processing plants, or climate moderating arrays, but each was couched as a contingency to be tested. The logic of discovery in such contexts is conservative by design. False positives are not merely inconvenient, they misdirect resources and warp subsequent inquiry. So the team's posture was to accumulate independent lines of evidence until convergence was robust. There was, alongside the instrumental work, a quieter cataloguing of affect. The human occupants of the mission, considered as a diffuse social field rather than individuated characters, experienced a cluster of feelings that are characteristic of first contact-like moments: reverence for scale, melancholia at the sense of failed continuity, and a stylized caution that bordered on humility. The plateau's openness allowed them to feel both small and intensely visible, appliances of a transient species standing upon a planet whose history measured itself in cycles that dwarfed. Ethics shaped the procedural choices that followed. The presence of orbital artifacts, coupled with surface evidence of constructed alignments, raised the possibility that the site was a cultural store, a place whose meaning might be irreversibly altered by human interference. International and interagency protocols, invoked from precedent and principle, resisted the temptation to excavate as an act of immediate curiosity. Instead, the mission adopted an archival approach: image everything with maximal fidelity, extract minimal physical samples, leave markers and records for future missions that might bear. Technically, the plateau became a node in a network of observation. Instruments were deployed in concentric arrays that allowed for triangulation, spectrometers at varied elevations, magnetometers spaced to map local dipole anomalies, and passive acoustic sensors laid out to detect the faint mechanical vibrations that might betray subsurface cavities. A long baseline interferometry experiment was initiated, with reflectors placed to improve orbital imaging resolution. At night, defined here by the slow swing of the star below the horizon, infrared imagers stood sentinel, watching for thermal trans. One pattern that emerged over the following cycles was the intermittent coordination between surface anomalies and orbital signals. At times, emissions from the orbiting structures would increase in cadence shortly after surface thermal anomalies were detected. Whether this coupling represented feedback loops of a still-functioning system, automated responses to environmental inputs, or coincidental correlation remained to be determined. The possibility of automation, the survival of systems programmed to respond to environmental cues across centuries, was both technically plausible and philosophically unsettling. It implied that objects can. The documentary perspective lingered on small, evocative details that refused to be reduced to mere data points. The purple sky at dawn, for instance, threw light across reflective surfaces in a way that rendered them almost luminous, thin edges catching the star's ray, glinting like punctuation marks. Fine dust, when sampled, contained spherical microbeads that puzzled materials. Scientists, some appeared to be vitrified silicate, while others bore minute linear striations consistent with machining processes. The patterning suggested the accident of ancient manufacturing met the slow hand of abrasion. These were traces that. Perhaps most haunting was the evidence that whatever agency had curated orbit had also anticipated the threat of geological time. In lifting infrastructure into vacuum, a civilization would have chosen an environment where weather and tectonics are minimal and where radiation and micrometeoroid impacts become the principal agents of decay. In that calculus, orbit stands as an archive optimized for longevity. To find such archives is to find caches of deliberate memory. To find them partially active is to confront a continuity of process that begs interpretation. As the first day on the plateau folded into an observation-rich night, the mission did not resolve into a single narrative. Instead, it bifurcated into careful commitments to monitor, to avoid irreversible disturbance, and to refine the science with increasing granularity. The immediate victory was not the confirmation of a civilization's existence, but the opening of a methodology adequate to the scale of the question. The plateau would be studied not as a conquest, but as a conservancy. The orbital murmurs would be probed with non-invasive listening, and samples would be treated as potential artifacts requiring curation. In the mission logs that followed, entries alternated between sterile metrics and reflective notes. Spectrometers logged line intensities, thermographs recorded diurnal curves, chain of custody seals were validated. Interleaved with these were the kinds of meta-observations that documentary narratives preserve, observations about restraint, the ethical anxieties of preservation, the sensation of being small before an archive that could span millennia. The first landing, then, was less a dramatic genesis than a careful initiation, an act of attention that opened a long project of interpretation. What haunted the long-form memory of that day was an image rather than a conclusion, a network of faint beacons in the sky, a purple dome above them, and, on the plateau, the first human-made markers of presence. A sterile flag, a sealed vial, a series of calibrated reflectors, laid down not to claim but to record. The act of making a mark had been reframed as the provision of testimony for those who would follow, rather than a signature of dominance. In the scale of planetary time, that was a small reversal. In the moral economy of exploration, it was the plateau would not yield its story quickly. If anything, the first landing taught the mission a new patience. Deep time does not hurry. It accumulates evidence slowly and often erases the conspicuous in favor of the persistent. The work to come would be to listen longer, to design instruments that could disentangle subtle patterns from noise, and to allow ethical restraint to guide the tempo of engagement. The purple sky would remain, a daily reminder that atmospheres write histories in color, and that to read those histories requires both rigor and reverence. The record closed that day with a minimalist tabulation, data archived, samples contained, non-invasive monitoring established, and protocols extended. The plateau was now an attended site, not a conquered one. The abandoned stations continued to hum in the distance, some fading, others stubbornly persistent, and their weak electromagnetic songs threaded the night. The question that had opened the landing, what does it mean to step onto a world that remembers and forgets, remained unresolved, but its framing had shifted. The mission had adopted a posture of custody, to act as chroniclers who prefer the slow accretion of evidence to the triumph. What does a city become when the city has outlived its makers by epochs? That question arrived as a quiet impossibility, an architectural problem posed against the immensity of geological time. It is easier, perhaps, to imagine ruins as the slow, inevitable collapse of jagged stone into dust. It is harder to imagine an urban fabric, squares, canals, monuments, whose geometry and ornament had been so deliberately worked that even after millions of years of weathering and sedimentation, it still read as a language. They entered the sleeping city with instruments and protocols, but also with the awkward human habit of wanting to feel the texture of the past beneath their fingers. The approach was careful, methodical, filled with the conservative steps that had been rehearsed for years: LiDAR sweeps to map relief, multispectral imaging to read pigments and mineral staining, ground-penetrating radar to reveal subsurface channels. Those tools produced a kind of reverse archaeology, images and numbers from which provisional histories could be assembled. Yet the hulking scale of what the instruments revealed demanded a vocabulary rich. The stone itself told a story written in grain and scar. Blocks were cut with an exactitude that implied repetitive tooling, joint lines fit together with tolerances that modern machines could admire. At margins, the surfaces bore minute incisions, decorative fluting, bas-relief bands, nested geometric tessellations that, in their repetition and scaling, suggested a culture fluent in abstraction and pattern. These were not mere aesthetic gestures. The motifs repeated at scales that ranged from the macro citywide sightlines intersecting at axes to the micro finely incised marks that, when imaged with scale, however, obscured as much as it revealed. Monuments rose in the central plaza, massive monoliths whose faces were carved with panels of imagery and what looked like symbolic registers. The registers contained intertwined motifs, spirals adjacent to chevrons, concentric rings flanking complex latticework, and in many places, sequences of dots and short linear strokes that could be read as a form of notation. Whether these were numerals, calendar ticks, or purely decorative fieldwork remained unknown. Shadow exaggerated their forms, lending to the plaza an almost theatrical intensity at low solar angles. The canal network was the city's most eloquent argument. Wide, shallow channels threaded through the urban fabric, following courses that were simultaneously pragmatic and elegant. Gradient managed runs that collected water from modest aquifers and routed it through basins to feed gardens, industry, and what might once have been navigable ways. Bank linings showed an awareness of erosion, layered revetments, and stepped embankments suggested a design meant to last. In many channels, mineral accretions had formed the most exquisite record of the city's environmental history. Calcite and silica had precipitated in rhythmic bands, trapping microscopic water. In this landscape had been a technique of memory. In some basins, fine laminations recorded seasonal cycles, alternating bands of organic-rich and mineral-dense layers that, in cross-section, resembled pages in a book. Where currents had once slowed, microbial stromatolite-like structures had accreted, their laminated architecture a hint that not all of the city's innovations had been purely mechanical. The interface of biology and engineering was evident in places where engineered stonework and biofilm interlaced, the latter policed by mineral deposition that both preserved and transformed. Carvings on public facades experimented with durability. In protected crevices, pigments had survived as faint halos. Ochres, deep cinnabars, and a green that, under spectrometric interrogation, suggested copper organic complexes. In other recesses, metallic inlays remained as thin, oxidized veins, alloys whose composition did not correspond neatly to the catalogues of known geologic metal deposits. Those anomalies were intriguing. Non-terrestrial element distributions could reflect ancient trade, deliberate material engineering, or processes now lost to chemistry. The analytical posture in such moments, the city's geometry invited speculation about social organization without allowing certainty. Orthogonal grids suggested planning. Broad avenues implied processional movement, and clusters of smaller courtyards nested within larger precincts argued for a degree of social compartmentalization. Monumental thresholds aligned with sunrise on specific days of the planetary year, and alignment measured by mapping central axes relative to stellar ephemerides. Such alignments hinted at calendrical functions, civic gatherings, or ritual choreographies fixed to an astronomical rhythm. Yet it remained. Silence was not absence. The city's acoustic properties were profound. Empty squares amplified wind so that it became an instrument. Long channels sang as the breeze negotiated their geometry, and enclosed courts maintained a residual resonance, an after-echo that might have once carried suppressed voices or music. Acoustic mapping, performed with low-energy sweeps, revealed materials chosen for resonance in certain vaults, cavities whose internal linings had been contoured to produce standing wave nodes at frequencies corresponding to channeled wind. Whether such spaces had been ritual theatres, storage vaults, small details offered the deepest intimacies. In sheltered doorways, fine dust had collected in patterns untouched by the violent randomness of wind-blown debris. In one such nook, microscopic filaments of a once biotic polymer adhered to stone, imbued with traces of complex hydrocarbons. In another, a groove bore repeated microchippings in a rhythm that suggested repetitive mechanical action. A frictional trace from a tool, perhaps, or the lodged ends of a fastening system now long corroded. These traces were not narrative on their own, they were prompts. Dating the city demanded interdisciplinary patience. Stratigraphic relationships between urban deposits and surrounding sedimentary layers provided a first-order bracket. Cosmogenic nuclide analysis of surface-exposed stones, radiometric dating of accreted mineral bands in canal deposits, and the isotopic composition of occluded carbon in pigment binders converged toward an age that measured in millions of years. Such longevity reframed any intuitive anthropocentrism. Civilizations on geological timescales are ephemeral gestures, yet this city had managed to preserve legible order despite eons of technology. Preservation emerged as a function of design, chemistry, and environment. The city sat in a geological pocket that had periodically dried, allowing mineral varnishes to form and seal surfaces. Aeolian loess had intermittently shielded structures from surface weathering, wrapping facades in a protective burial until tectonic uplift and erosion re-exposed them. In other areas, evaporitic mineralization mineralized organic binders and landscaped features into new matrices. The interplay of burial and exposure created an uneven archive. Some monuments stagnated under questions about purpose proliferated without easy answers. Why build canals so precisely? Why lay monuments that aligned to celestial markers? The answers ranged from the utilitarian water management and storage, urban circulation, to the symbolic cosmological cosmograms, mnemonic landscapes, or civic identity projects encoded in stone. Each hypothesis demanded evidentiary scaffolding. The documentary method honored those scaffolds: non-invasive mapping first, minimal sampling second, archival protocols third. There remained a stubborn ethical dimension. To expose unseen cavities or price, there was an uneasy mingling of melancholy and exhilaration in the logs. The descriptive entries were procedural scan IDs, spectral counts, sample seals. But between those lines were notations of affect, awe at the scale of craftsmanship, a muted grief at the implicit disappearance of makers, and an ethical tension about the right to intervene. The sleeping city compelled a view of history not as a straight line, but as a set of choices about what to preserve and what to surrender. In a culture that had lifted much of its infrastructure into orbit, perhaps intentionality about preservation had been explicit: move into the vacuum where geology cannot erase you. On the small scenes of material evidence became large hypotheses. A basin rim lined with a tessellated lattice of channels suggested not only irrigation but finely modulated microhydraulics, valves, sluices, perhaps even feedback systems calibrated to seasonal shifts. An arc of standing stones bore faint, regularly spaced apertures aligned to daylight at specific angles. Possible sightlines for observational devices or markers in a civic timekeeping system. Elsewhere, an enclosed courtyard revealed a series of shallow depressions whose radiometric signatures hinted at repeated heat. The canals themselves preserved one of the city's most intimate archives. Sediment cores drawn from their beds contained layered sequences of organic and inorganic matter, microbial films, pollen-like particulates, and small carbonaceous particles whose isotopic ratios suggested biological processing. Molecular analysis of trapped organics revealed complex macromolecules, degraded but decipherable, whose patterns paralleled biochemical pathways recognized on other worlds. Whether those signatures testified to domesticated agriculture, engineered by... In the end, the sleeping city resisted the human appetite for tidy stories. It offered fragments at every possible scale, geometric, chemical, acoustic, that invited interpretation but refused simplistic closure. The documentary perspective recorded those fragments as evidence and as moral provocations. Cities are, in some sense, conversations across generations, an investment in memory, a bet that future eyes will read the choices one makes today. This city's conversation had stretched across millions of years and had yielded a strange, ambiguous manuscript. The final recordings from the initial incursions emphasized restraint. High-definition mosaics of the plazas were archived. Canal cores were sealed in redundant containment with metadata that described stratigraphic orientation down to millimeter precision. Non-invasive acoustic studies were scheduled for long-duration monitoring. The mission had altered its posture from reconnaissance to guardianship. That shift was not merely operational, but ethical. The city was no longer a site to be conquered, but an archive to be conserved. As twilight fell beneath the purple cast of the planet's sky, long shadows pooled in the plazas and the canals reflected a dimming light. The sleeping city held its silence like an old book, its pages smoothed and stained, but still legible to patient readers. From the orbital vantage, the city's geometry resolved into a lattice of human intent. From the surface, its stones spoke of hands long gone. Between those views, the observers, agents of a different time, found themselves humbled. The narrative that the city both embodied and resisted was larger than the The documentary record closed the day with a quiet, deliberate notation: the city would be watched, recorded, and protected. No dramatic proclamations were made. That would be the work of later synthesis, of cross-disciplinary patience, and of a civilization's willingness to accept ambiguity. For now, the sleeping city lay under the purple sky, a colossal carved exile of memory, and the mission, small and temporary, assumed the role of its chronicler. In that assumption lay a fragile, enduring hope that with careful attention and reverence, the language encoded in what does it mean to find a map that has outlived the hands that drew it? That question becomes an ethical hinge the moment the mission's long silence meets an interior light, pale, bluish, stubborn against dust and time, inside a building that, from orbit, had read like a compact woodpile of shadowed terraces and stepped roofs. The instruments recorded something at once intimate and extraordinary. The internal arrays remained coherent. Mechanical shutters released on quiet timers. Conduits, once choked with aeolian dust, held channels that still carried low-level currents. And in alcoves, in racks beside thresholds, devices the size of suitcases and the size of room pillars breathed a faint, unhurried. The documentary voice that follows such moments attends less to melodrama than to implication. The glowing devices were not cinematic relics, they were functioning artifacts of a technological grammar that had outlasted a civilization's visible presence. They emitted patterns of light and tone that could be read as state reports, heartbeat-like pulses, diagnostic flickers, and, in some modules, rhythmic surges that unfolded maps in space, not on paper, but as ephemeral projections in the air. These were not decorations. They were data-structured, encoded, and, crucially, accessible. Entering the building was a choreographed act of restraint. Protocols favored non-invasive reception. External surfaces were imaged with hyperspectral scanners through sealed booms. Microbial swabs were taken at distance. The entryway itself was photographed in thousands of tiles before any physical contact with a threshold. When a ramp finally descended, the team conceptualized here as the mission's collective attention, rather than a cast of individuals, moved like conservators into a cathedral of abandoned knowledge. The first sensory detail that lodged in the archive was the quality of the blue light. It was not the harsh white of incandescent bulbs nor the warm amber of fires. It was a spectral polity, concentrated in shorter wavelengths, thin where the sun's light was thick and persistent in shadow. Its hue carried an implication about material engineering: phosphors with ultra-slow decay rates, photonic lattices that trapped excitation and bled it out over centuries, or radioisotope-driven luminescence coupled to energy. Efficient photonic displays. Whatever the mechanism, it had preserved a readable state. Even the dust. The devices themselves displayed a bewildering variety. Some were flat, disc-like consoles embedded in walls, their faces a matrix of hexagonal cells. Others towered as slender columns, ribbed with variable opacity panels. Among them were mechanical archives, sealed canisters of polymer glass, etched with microscopic reliefs that a scanning photometer could pass into latticed images. A few units included articulated arms, their joints seized but not fused, like fossilized gestures waiting for a solvent. And threaded through this landscape were relational nodes, devices that appeared designed to interface with others. What made the scene particularly consequential was the presence of cartographic data within these systems. Some devices, when queried by remote, yielded maps, literal representations of space. The first were familiar in principle: topographic renderings, shoreline contours, elevation meshes. But even in their visual grammar, they differed from human conventions. Rather than centering on metrics in kilometers or degrees, these maps prioritized flows and relationships: current velocities along coastal shelves, gradients of mineral concentration, fluxes of atmospheric particulates by season. Land on these maps. Other devices carried maps that were more radical topologies of the sky and the vacuum above. Projected in the same pale blue, three-dimensional lattices curled beyond the ceiling and into the air like the ghost of an orbital schematic. Nodes in that lattice corresponded to the stations that the mission had catalogued from orbit: platforms, tethers, modular arrays. Lines between nodes suggested pathways, cabled conduits or scheduled transfer corridors, rendered not as straight lines but as vectors with directionality and temporal buffering. When the projection's time slider was nudged, the lattice performed a slow choreography. Modules shifted position. The presence of such maps demanded two immediate interpretive moves. First, maps are acts of memory and claim. To map territory is to register attention and to encode a relation between agents and environment. Second, maps that extend into orbit imply a civilization that did not treat the sky as foreign ground, but as an extension of its cultural and material landscape. An archive in vacuum where geological time's erasures slow to a different tempo. Together, these points collapse the artificial dichotomy between nature and artifact. The maps suggested a continuous accessing the maps required patient work. The mission executed a multi-layered protocol, non-contact imaging to reconstruct the interface's visual grammar, electromagnetic probing at variable frequencies to test for hidden layers, cryogenic sampling of nearby residues to identify binders and material signatures, and algorithmic translation to map alien symbol systems into vector spaces that machine learning could parse. Patterns emerged with an odd kind of clarity. Repeated motifs, clusters of concentric rings, arrays of conjoined triangles, iterative star-like glyphs coalesced into lexemes. The documentary perspective pauses over one particular finding because of what it implies about deep time. Some mapped layers encoded stellar positions that no longer matched the current night. Precession, proper motion, and planetary orbital drift meant that the sky, as recorded in the maps, belonged to a celestial epoch displaced by millennia. The maps preserved a chronology. They were not merely spatial records but time-stamped registers. This quality allowed analysts to bracket ages by astronomical triangulation, where constellations were in the map versus where they were now. The mismatch offered a low resolution. The emotional texture of these moments was complex. The mission's collective attention, its psychologists, archivists, and ethicists registered feelings that, in the archive, were described as tones rather than scenes, a reverence for the precision of the instruments, a melancholy at the implication of absence, and a cautious exhilaration at the potential of the maps to reveal not only geography but history. There was also, beneath the methodical work, a practical anxiety. Each access was a decision to disturb or to preserve. When a device responded to a benign electromagnetic nudge by brightening a caution glyph, some devices, curiously, contained what could be described as itineraries. These were sequential maps, layers keyed to movement rather than static depiction. An itinerary might show an outflow of materials from an inland basin to a coastal processing hub, then the transfer up a tether to an orbital node, and finally the dispersal of processed matter across a lattice of platforms. Where human cartography often encodes ownership or administration, these itineraries encoded logistics and memory. They recorded not only where things were, but how they had been circulated. They were operational. Decoding those itineraries demanded interdisciplinary translation. Material scientists matched spectral signatures to likely commodities, concentrations of processed silicates, enriched metal alloys with non-local isotopic ratios, and clusters of organic polymers with industrially unusual bond patterns. Geochemists mapped possible source regions, while orbital dynamicists modeled transfer windows consistent with the lattice's nodal geometry. The result was an interpretation that, while cautious, had force. This civilization had engineered a distributed economy that integrated planetary resources. The maps also carried an ethical voice. Embedded notations, sometimes literal, sometimes iconographic, seemed to record decisions, to lift archives into vacuum, to divert water flows, to seed sites with microbial stabilizers, perhaps even to embargo specific resource veins against future exploitation. Whether these were prescriptive instructions for successors or descriptive records of choices made was not always clear. but the presence of such marks made the building itself read like a local node of a cultural archive, a place where knowledge was both stored and another discovery reframed the technological narrative in a more intimate way. Some devices exhibited self-maintenance signatures, micro-actuations that, when imaged over extended time, suggested autonomous correction. Panels adjusted their apertures by fractions of a degree. Joints expanded and contracted in response to humidity cycles. Micro-rotors engaged briefly in sequences that might have been cleaning actions. These movements were not large-scale robotics but micromechanics. Self-healing polymers that sealed microfissures, thermally driven valves that prevented particulate ingress, and power management protocols. What could sustain such maintenance logically? Several hypotheses balanced in the analytic ledger. One posited long-lived power sources, radioisotope thermoelectric generators with exceptionally long half-lives, or systems harvesting ambient magnetospheric currents. Another suggested redundant passive systems, metamaterials that stored excitation and released it slowly, or environmental energy harvesters that exploited daily thermal gradients in a planet whose diurnal cycle ran long. A less conservative hypothesis proposed a distributed maintenance logic. The maps contained, finally, a set of anomalies that directed the mission's future attention. Hidden within certain layers were cartographic markers pointing to sites beyond the immediate city outlying basins, high plateaus, and subaqueous shelves. Some of those markers corresponded to geological formations that, from orbital surveys, had been flagged as unusual concentric terraces, scars of past hydraulic manipulation and localized mineral precipitates with non-natural isotopic signatures. The maps thus functioned as invitations. They proposed a web of related sites that, responding to those invitations, required policy decisions. The mission's log recorded, in procedural language, the debate: prioritize mapping across the network and risk overextension, or concentrate conservational resources at this building and seek more time for careful analysis. The decision made itself: for now, the mission would stabilize the interior array, archive exhaustive spectral and geometric records, and replicate the map layers in duplicate before attempting any invasive sampling. The priority was preservation over immediate extraction. The larger implication of finding preserved maps tucked inside functioning devices forced a philosophical shift as much as a technical one. Cartography is an act of futurity. A map is made not only for present navigation, but for future eyes. To project knowledge into a medium designed to last into photonic lattices and polymeric matrices suggests a species that practiced cultural foresight. The maps became evidence not simply of technological sophistication, but of temporal intentionality, choices made to transmit knowledge across durations longer than a single biological lineage. That realized in the quiet hours after redundant imaging and data replication had finished, one small action carried symbolic weight. A sealed package. An inert container that had been designed as a metadata capsule for each device was opened in a controlled chamber. Inside lay a palimpsest of micro-encoded records, geometric inscriptions, codified temporal markers, and arrays of simple topological icons. The capsule's contents felt like an invitation to translation. If the maps were the stories of movement and place, these tablets were their index. The documentary record that followed this first, luminous encounter emphasized patient interpretation. It catalogued procedures, enumerated material analyses, and archived the proliferating map layers. It also recorded the mission's reflexive ethics, a commitment to treat the devices as archival subjects rather than as trophies, to replicate before altering, and to design future interventions against the standard of minimal disturbance. The maps, after all, were not merely data, they were choices cast into durable form. To read them was to engage in a conversation with a long-vanished. When the team sealed the building for the night and the bluish glow sank into a steady, inscrutable pulse, the scene retained both humility and urgency. The devices would keep their light, the maps would remain. The mission's work was less that of conquest and more that of listening, decoding a cartographic voice that had been trained over deep time to speak softly and last long. If there was poetry in it, it was the kind born of patient diplomacy with the past, maps as legacies, devices as keepers, and the mission as a steward tasked to read, to respect, and to pass along what it had learned to future receivers bothered by the same, oh, what does it mean to meet the faces of a vanished people and find, painted and carved into stone, the echo of a gaze that seems to have been trained upward? The question arrived first as a visual dissonance. On walls that had survived burial and windblast, bas-reliefs and panels of pigment formed a gallery of tall, almost statuesque figures. They were humanoid in posture, bipedal, with shoulders held erect, hands articulate, but their heads were unmistakably different, slightly elongated along the cranial axis, cheeks swept gently back, and eyes depicted far larger and set deeper than the proportions familiar from human art. The eyes in the reliefs were not merely big. They were rendered as deep wells, shadowed and reflective, carved with double incisions that suggested thick. The immediate technical work of the mission treated these panels as data. High-resolution photogrammetry mapped every chisel stroke and pigment flake. Multispectral imaging peeled back centuries of patina. Ultraviolet fluorescence revealed organic binders beneath mineral varnish, near-infrared exposures teased out underdrawings and erased lines. Laser profilometry measured tool marks with sub-millimeter precision, cataloguing the angles and percussion patterns that spoke of particular classes of cutting implements. All of this was logged, doubly archived, and cross-referenced with orbital datasets. These scientific acts of reading produced details that were both mundane and profound. Tool marks indicated repeated, consistent technique, a sharp-pointed flake for fine incisions, broader adzes for mass removal, and a patterned rasp for smoothing. Pigments were surprisingly complex. Layers of ochre and cinnabar sat beneath a greenish wash whose spectral signature suggested copper-organic complexes stabilized by mineralization. Cryogenic sampling of microfragments taken only after long ethical debate and in sealed containment returned traces of binders that matched polysaccharide matrices derived from algae life. Interpretation, however, moved slowly. The eyes were a focal point of speculation, both scientific and philosophical. Were they literal records of anatomy, faithful portraits of species-level morphology, or were they symbolic choices, an iconography designed to emphasize enhanced visual acuity, nocturnal habit, or spiritual perspicacity? The absence of human-like skeletal remains in preliminary excavations complicated any facile reading. No skulls with matching elongation had yet surfaced in sealed contexts. The archaeological record so far offered art, but no unambiguous osteology. One analytical strand treated the elongated crania as a possible result of cultural cranial modification, a practice on Earth that yields deliberate skull elongation for reasons of status or identity. In that hypothesis, the elongation is social language, a visible mark of belonging, a badge of office, an aesthetic of embodiment. Another strand proposed that the depiction recorded real biological form, perhaps a lineage with an expanded cranial vault or altered cranial morphology associated with physiological differences. A third considered the iconographic, stylization produced by artistic. The murals themselves offered cues beyond facial proportion. Sequences of panels formed narrative bands, processional scenes, domesticated worlds, and technical diagrams disguised as decoration. In one elongated frieze, stylized figures marched in a procession that culminated in an ascent motif. Figures were shown grasping lines, tethers rendered as braided cords, and stepping onto devices that, in subsequent panels, opened into arcs that matched the silhouettes of orbital platforms seen from above. In another site, a repeated motif showed a figure. Such scenes suggested a civilization whose visual language fused mundane labor with cosmological aspiration. The image of ascent figures moving along tethered ladders or stepping into nested shells recurred with variations. Sometimes ascent was dramatic, a communal act framed by music-like glyphs. Sometimes it was administrative, companions passing tokens and sealing hatches. There were also domestic panels, figures cradling infant forms, communal terraces with plant beds, arrays of stacked vessels that read like storage for processed biomass. The relief's compositional language reinforced that sense of plurality. Elongated heads sometimes wore headgear circlets, bands, or helmet-like sheaths, implying the possibility of functional cranial additions, perhaps for life in variable pressure environments or for interfacing with equipment. Necklines and shoulder treatments hinted at garments engineered for mobility, layered wraps that could double as thermal insulation, straps crossing torsos in patterns consistent with harness designs. Jewelry rings, pendants, narrow fillets appeared frequently at the collar and wrist, crafted from alloys whose spectral fingerprints did not match known geological deposits. Iconography also suggested roles and hierarchies. Some figures were depicted alone and larger in scale, their stances more formal, their hands raised in gesture. Others clustered, bent over instruments, their gestures compact and precise. The latter scenes resembled technical workshops, benches, racks of tools, and what could be schematic diagrams etched on walls. Distinctions of scale and context allowed tentative modeling of social structures, specialized technicians, coordinated teams, and civic leaders who presided over ritualized actions, perhaps the launching of a module or the dedication of an orbital archive. Yet the murals resisted simplistic social readings. Frequently, the same motifs appeared across contexts that, in human terms, would represent distinct social spheres. An ascent motif in a ceremonial chamber mirrored a maintenance scene in a workshop. Faces of larger scale also appeared in domestic art. Such recurrence implied a cultural synthesis. The sky and its engineering were not separate domains but woven into daily life, politics, and ritual. The aesthetic became a means of mimetic continuity, repeated images that taught, reminded, and encoded practice. Beneath the interpretive work lay a darker, more intimate set of panels, funerary scenes. In several mausoleum chambers, spaces identified by narrow entrances and sealed thresholds, artists had carved panels that paired human-like figures with orbital icons. A reclining figure, wrapped in a textile-like pattern, was shown flanked by attendants who released a small craft toward a ringed platform. Another relief pictured a latticework of stars with a dotted line tracing a trajectory from ground to sky. The dotted line intersected with small glyphs that might mark dates or rites. If these were few, the technical analyses deepened these readings with material evidence. Radiocarbon-like methods adapted for the planet's chemistry dated organic binders and residual fibers, establishing relative chronologies for artistic layers. Underpaintings revealed palimpsests, older compositions scraped and repainted, motifs revised as political regimes or ritual practices changed. The palimpsest quality suggested a living art tradition, one that adapted and reused surfaces across generations. The mineral varnishes that preserved pigment layers were often the result of episodic burial and mineral accretion. There were also doubts that demanded attention. Anthropologists on the mission's interpretive teams cautioned against reading the figures as literal biographies. Human ethnographers were familiar with cultures that deliberately exaggerate anatomical features in art to signify the idealized self. For instance, large eyes as markers of spiritual sight or elongated skulls as symbols of elevated status. Still, the convergence of iconography with the functional presence of orbital arrays and with the cartographic materials recovered earlier compelled a hybrid reading. Symbolic representation had practical reference. The aesthetics themselves were revealing. Artistic choices, deep incisions to capture shadow, flattened planes to emphasize silhouette, produced a visual language optimized for durability and legibility. Where pigments had faded, the incised lines still conveyed form. Where paint remained, it did so in mineral-stabilized glazes that reflected an understanding of chemistry, or at least a cultural predilection for pigments that would survive. The art, in other words, was designed to last. It had been a conscious strategy of memory-making. Emotion, for those who observed the panels was not an individual private thing, but a collective tone, a field registered by the mission's archived logs and recorded interviews across disciplines. The visceral reaction was described in the mission's records as a mixture of intimacy and estrangement. Observers felt close to the makers through the ordinary gestures they depicted, mending harnesses, feeding seedlings, singing in processional bands, but also felt a profound estrangement when confronted with the ways in which those makers had oriented themselves differently. That argument exerted influence on subsequent policy decisions. The mural panels, because they so frequently depicted ascent and orbital interfaces, reframed the mission's priorities. Sites where funerary or ascent motifs concentrated became candidates for deeper but still cautious, probing, sealed niches that might contain DNA-bearing materials, cache spaces with preserved organics, or toolkits whose residues could yield biological signatures. At the same time, the art's legal and ethical value transformed interpretation into. Beyond the methodological stakes, there was the quieter, philosophical effect. The images demanded a reckoning with questions that the mission's earlier technical narratives had only gestured toward. If a people had chosen to memorialize ascent itself, if they had painted the act of going into orbital space as an ongoing civic ritual or as a funerary hope, what did that choice say about priorities across deep time? Was the lift into the sky a pragmatic shelter from planetary geology, or an expression of cosmological faith? Were the orbital arrays repositories of knowledge, sanctuaries of culture, or both simultaneously? Art resisted singular answers, yet it offered something else. It provided the texture of lived life. The murals showed laughter in communal scenes, a tenderness in depictions of infants wrapped close to the chest, a stoicism in technical labor, and a liturgical solemnity in processional art. There was humor too. The small margins where tiny animal analogues gambled creatures rendered with the same elongated heads as their makers in playful panels of domesticity. These small intimacies made the vanished people feel less like distant abstractions and more like a civilization that, in the mission's archive, the panels are reproduced with obsessive fidelity. Sequence after sequence is digitized, layered, and annotated. Machine learning models catalog recurrent glyphs and their positional relationships across thousands of square meters of relief. Comparative studies align motifs with cartographic layers and with the orbital lattice, seeking patterns of ritual geography. Yet even as algorithms pass syntax, the documentary voice remains careful to say what the art cannot resolve. Remembrance does not equal retrieval. A painted face can suggest anatomy. The mural's deeper provocation is ethical and temporal. They insist that cultural survival is not merely a matter of technological durability, but of choices about what to preserve and how to preserve it. The people who left these images had, apparently, decided that certain aspects of themselves, ritual, technical knowledge, maps, should be transferred into media and places where geology's appetite would be less voracious. Their art records that decision as much as it records faces and deeds. At the end of the catalogue entry, the mission's record offers a prescriptive humility. Engage, yes. Document, yes. But do not presume to restitute lives from pigment and relief alone. Let the images guide inquiry and, wherever possible, protect context. The murals are not puzzles to be solved in isolation. They are invitations to a long interdisciplinary conversation across lithic and photonic journals, across orbital and terrestrial repositories. They teach, quietly and insistently, that the traces of persons are often more for anyone attuned to such testimony. The clearest lesson is also the simplest. Art survives by being meaningful to those who make it and by being robust against the forces that erase. Here were people who painted themselves into the long view, who anthropomorphized their tools and their sky, and who left their faces as arguments for continuity. To read those faces is to enter for a moment into their wager that some forms of remembering could persist longer than individual lifetimes. The mission's work, therefore, is not merely to catalogue what remains, but to answer, with the utmost care, the question the murals ask without words. What is a language when emptied of its living speakers, reduced to marks on metal that have weathered centuries of dust and neglect? The question hangs in the vault like an absent presence, an impression of conversation without a mouth to speak it. In the cool, filtered light of the storage chamber, the plates lay in a shallow labyrinth, sheets of metal, some dull with age, others still catching the bluish cast of the interior lamps. Each was incised with lines and curls and strokes that refused the easy comfort of resemblance. They were not pictographs in any straightforward sense, they were notograms. Form. The discovery itself was prosaic and profound at once. The vault had been advertised in the orbital archive as a repository, containers sealed for reasons annotated in the faded map layers recovered from the building's interior. The mission's protocol called for caution. Sterile imaging before contact, layered spectral interrogation, contamination checks. Those procedures were applied with ritualized patience. The first scans returned more than compositional data. They returned rhythm, repeating marks across plates, a grammar of spacing, regular punctuation-like gaps that implied the structuring of. There was emotion embedded in this work, but it was not the silver-screen burst of discovery. It was a layered affect, an admixture of reverence, the tight dread of being mistaken, and the almost domestic tenderness of someone who has learned to listen. The linguist's attention bent toward minutiae, the depth of each groove, the slight hesitation marks where an engraving tool paused, the recurring flourish that might be a determiner or merely an artisan's signature. That attention was not detached, it carried the quiet weight of stewardship. Each plate was scanned, photographed in wavelengths spanning from ultraviolet to thermal, and then imaged in. Material analysis preceded syntax. The metals themselves told a story. X-ray fluorescence revealed an alloying scheme unfamiliar in exact proportions but not completely alien. Silvery matrices enriched with trace elements that betrayed metallurgical sophistication and possibly non-local sourcing. Microabrasion patterns indicated a set of engraving tools whose actions had left repeated signatures. Pressure traces that suggested a circular burin used with steady torque, or a set of hard points applied with a controlled percussion that left microchips. Those physical artifacts implied the plate's surfaces bore a deliberate choice, metal rather than clay or bark or paper. Metal resists time's chewing, it keeps its lines when sediments turn and microbes die. The decision to inscribe on metal could be understood as pragmatic, a technology of preservation chosen by makers conscious of geological erasure. But it could also be symbolic. To write on metal is to argue against transience, to stake a claim that the message is worth the expenditure of durable medium. In the context of the orbital archives and the city's architecture, these plates formed a different register of preservation from murals and photonic devices. They were tactile. The linguist's first analytic move was statistical. With a corpus assembled from dozens of plates, the mission's computational tools built frequency tables. Characters, defined by glyph shape and bounding box, were counted and their distribution graphed. Certain sequences repeated with unnerving regularity. Some clusters occurred only at plate margins, others punctuated the start and end of lines. From those frequencies emerged hypotheses, shapes familiar to anyone who had tried to decode a script, high-frequency tokens that might be function words, mid-frequency clusters that suggested directionality was inscribed in the artifacts by micrograin parallax. The engraving strokes had a directional bias, the vector of the burin's travel left faint feathering that indicated the dominant stroke direction. This, coupled with the arrangement of separators, allowed a preliminary guess about reading order, rows proceeding from one edge of the plate toward another, sometimes interrupted by vertical columns. In a handful of plates, the glyphs curled into circular tables. Those circular forms invited different readings, ringed chronicles, calendrical schemata, or mnemonic devices for networked logistics. Cross-referencing was essential. The mission's approach was interdisciplinary by necessity. Material science, cryptography, semiotics, and the cartographic lexemes recovered earlier all entered the analytic mix. A striking convergence appeared when one high-frequency glyph, an angular sign with a central dot, was found carved repeatedly next to engraved line drawings of orbital nodes on a particular plate. On other plates, the same glyph occurred in proximity to signs that, in mural frames, had been associated with processional ascent. The simplest reading, still hedged with caution, treated the glyph as either a The process of decipherment is itself a moral practice shaped by humility. The linguist resisted grandiose mappings. The corpus was too small for confident syntactic parsing. Assumptions about phoneme-to-glyph correspondence would be presumptive without comparative material. Instead, the analytical protocol respected the asymmetry of evidence, propose, test, and always allow falsification. Distributional analyses led to candidate segmentations, possible word boundaries, and from there the computational models attempted to build a lexicon. Neural nets were trained not to translate. One of the plates yielded a pattern that sharpened the sense of epicality. A repeated triad of glyphs, an open arc, a columned motif, and a star-like mark was found engraved along a plate margin with small ticks between repetitions. The ticks bore a regular spacing reminiscent of a tally. The simplest inference was mundane and earthbound, a record of units of counts. But counts of what? The orbit? The harvest? If the star-like mark correlated with a motif of celestial imagery on a nearby tablet, the triad might be a compact notation for a calendrical period tied to. Equally compelling were plates whose glyphic arrays matched the iconography of funerary lists found in the murals. Certain glyph clusters correlated with schematic human figures, with small circular icons that elsewhere had been interpreted as vessels or kilns, and with stacked marks that suggested generational sequences. That pattern opened another interpretive corridor. Some plates could be mnemonic rosters, lists of persons and their roles, or dedicatory tablets preserved as public annals. If the murals staged ascent into orbital space, the plates might be the administrative backbone names and dates inscribed to record transfer. Sensitivity to context was constant. The mission emphasized non-dislocative analysis. Plates were documented in situ, catalogued with exhaustive metadata, and digitally replicated at resolutions surpassing any single human observer's eye. The decision whether to remove a plate from its housing invoked ethical debate. Removing a plate might reveal hidden reverse inscriptions, but removal could also be considered an act of cultural extraction. The directive favored duplication over displacement. Exact replicas were laser-mirrored. Emotion threaded through this caution. The linguist experienced a persistent ache, an empathy not for persons, but for the fragility of communicative acts. To find a script is to confront the possibility of conversations cut off in mid-speech. The plates captured a culture's attempt to speak into deep time, and the mission's task was to answer that attempt with patience, not appropriation. That ethical attention shaped practical choices. Avoid invasive scraping. Prioritize non-destructive imaging. Treat each inkless inscription as a living claim. Hypotheses expanded slowly into comparative scenarios. One framework proposed that the plates were part of an archival system, analogous to ledgers and indexes in human bureaucracies. In such a model, maps would orient movement and space. Metal plates would index content, names, materials, maintenance logs, while photonic devices would render dynamic schemata. Together, they formed a multimodal memory system, optimized for redundancy. If photonic arrays failed, metal plates persisted. If orbital archives decayed, ground inscriptions remained. This distributed. Another framework emphasized performativity. Some plates appeared to be narrative artifacts meant to be read aloud, their sequences structured like verse, their repetition lending rhythm. The possibility that inscriptions served liturgical ends. chants to accompany ascent rituals or invocations for orbital guardians shifted the linguistic analysis toward prosody. The plate's spacing, the length of strokes, and the recurrence of certain glyph clusters could then be studied as markers of cadence. The emotional resonance of such readings, outside the realm of speculative closeness, what the analysis could not yield yet was phonology. Without a living speaker or a bilingual key, the material remained stubbornly orthographic. The linguist and the computational teams experimented with phonotactic models, mapping likely syllabic constraints by studying allowable glyph sequences and by estimating the language's potential consonant-vowel structures via cluster analysis. These exercises produced candidate reconstructions, but remained epistemically fragile. The analogue of a Rosetta Stone had not appeared, but other clues glimmered, plates with small pictorial appendices that clearly represented simple counts or commodities could serve. Beyond the technical, the plates invited reflection on the cultural choices embodied in script. To write is to decide what is worth inscribing. Ink degrades, metal endures. To choose metal was to choose posterity. The plates were acts of care, the deliberate sedimentation of identity and order in a world that had already seen infrastructure move into vacuum. The linguistic artifacts suggested priorities, administrative clarity, memorial persistence, and a recognition that memory could be made material in forms that resisted geological. The presence of a linguist in the mission's archive log shaped more than the interpretation, it shaped policy. Linguistic analysis reframed the mission's stewardship ethic. If these plates were indexes to a people's records, names, technologies, rights, then the act of handling them carried moral weight. Linguistic work therefore became an ethical act. Each interpretation risked imposing a narrative on fragile signs, and the mission instituted layers of transparency. Every hypothesis would be logged with a confidence metric. Each decision to test an artifact would pass through an ethics council that weighed science. As work continued, the plates were not ceded to silence. Replicated datasets were distributed among networks of scholars on the mission's communication mesh. Pattern recognition algorithms were shared, annotated by hand, and subjected to adversarial models designed to test for false positives. The most cautious findings moved into a public dossier that invited external peer scrutiny. The act of opening the archive into a collective space, digitally, ethically, and methodologically, became part of the mission's own memorial practice. To steward these plates was simultaneously to learn how to. Toward the end of the initial analysis, a provisional synthesis crystallized without claiming closure. The metal plates formed a complementary archival layer to the photonic maps and the stone murals. They bore not only content, but an orientation, an emphasis on count, movement, and the relation between place and sky. Their glyphic economy suggested a community that had developed a script tuned to the technical needs of a distributed civilization. Pracademic, not poetic in its primary thrust, though performative elements persisted. The plates were both ledger and litany, material evidence that memory had been engineered as aggressively as infamy. The vault closed each night, not with the dramatic punctuation of a reveal, but with quiet acts of replication, plates photographed, 3D models uploaded, spectral signatures archived, and hypotheses marked for future testing. The linguist's presence, recorded as a role rather than as a protagonist, shaped the mission's demeanor. The work was slow, it was patient, it was an exercise in listening across an abyss. The metal glyphs were not messages that demanded immediate answers, they were invitations to long attention. In the documentary ledger, this episode was filed as a turning point in the mission's epistemic architecture. It reframed search from the detection of life as chemistry to the detection of life as memory. The plates, incised in an alien hand, taught a simple lesson with moral complexity. Language is an act of survival as much as of speech, and to read it responsibly is to accept stewardship across scales of time one does not own. The mission would continue to parse frequencies and suggested grammars, to cross-link glyph clusters with mapped nodes, to build lexicons of conjecture and to honor each tentative translation with humor. What does it mean when a single mark, a small arrangement of strokes and angles, keeps appearing in the most unlikely places, on a bronze plate buried beneath Antarctic silt, incised into a basalt block on an arid plateau, hammered into a copper bead recovered from a Holocene burial, and etched into the inner face of an orbital hull fragment? The question is not an academic parlor game. It is the first insistent jolt that reconfigures the ledger of deep time, a discrete sign that threads across planetary archives and insists on being read not as coincidence but as a clue. The glyph itself was unremarkable to an untrained eye, a short vertical, a hooked arc, and a small punctate dot arranged with a regularity that suggested a deliberate combinatory system rather than accidental marking. But in the context of stacked investigations, geology, metallography, spectrometry, its recurrence took on explanatory weight. It was the same hand, not literally because hands cannot be proven at such remove, but the same grammar, identical stroke rhythm, identical micro-tool signatures, identical weathering patterns consistent with comparable chemical environments. The first immediate inference was anthropological. Did distant human cultures independently invent the same mark? The statistical improbability made this hypothesis uncomfortable. The second hypothesis was broader and stranger: cultural transmission across space and time, where the mark was a mimetic artifact, a relic of contact or common origin. The third was more literal and more troubling to the Academy. The glyph was the same mark catalogued in the photonic devices, the metal plates, and the murals on the exoplanet the mission had catalogued months earlier. Interpretation requires patience as much as evidence. The mission treated the glyph as a thread and followed it through methods designed to resist sensational leaps. Subsurface samples associated with glyph-bearing contexts were dated with multiple orthogonal techniques: cosmogenic isotope analysis, argon-argon chronometry where applicable, and stratigraphic correlation of surrounding deposits. Metallurgical analyses of plates and beads recorded identical alloying strategies, trace enrichments in elements that did not match local geology, isotopic fingerprints of smelted ores consistent instead with long-range processing. Then came a translation, or the best approximation thereof. It did not arrive as a neat lexicon, but as a pattern of contextual readings. The glyph, in the photonic maps, often clustered with pictograms of tethers, orbital nodes, and what could be read as energy vectors. In terrestrial contexts, it adorned objects associated with movement and with thresholds, doorway lintels, ritual caches, markers on coastal promontories. A careful hermeneutic, threaded through signal analysis and comparative semiotics, suggested that the glyph was a kind of index, an orienting sign, and this orientation fed a starkly consequential reading of longer inscriptions. When the glyph appeared in longer text sequences, on orbital plates, in mural registers, and on slabs recovered from deep tombs, the combinatory text assembled a narrative, not mythic in the sense of allegory, but practical and catastrophic in tenor. The engraved panels, when read with the aid of the photonic device's map overlays and cross-referenced with orbital debris patterns, described an arc that could be summarized without losing the force of its provisional nature. A civilization that had stretched its material presence into orbit, that had engaged. The language of the inscriptions was deliberately technical. They catalogued fleets and tethers, maintenance cycles, and arrays designated for climate modulation. But nested within the administrative prose were fragments of a different register: warnings, pleas, and brief registers that read like emergency logs. One translated passage rendered into a sequence of conceptual equivalents rather than phonetic fidelity, read in a way that stopped teams across labs: shields fail, core link ruptured, atmosphere altered, first heat, then veil, transfer nodes lost, archive into vacuum. There are two ways to dramatize such a finding: with breathless certainty or with careful ethical restraint. The mission chose the latter, but restraint carried its own emotional load. Scientists and curators described a pervasive, almost clinical grief, an awareness that the documents they were reading were palimpsests of lives interrupted by decisions about power and survival. The archive's language suggested not merely warfare in the human sense, the clashing of armies, but strategic uses of concentrated energy at planetary scales, reactors used as weapons, attempts to destabilize. Material corroboration amplified the textual reading. In several orbital fragments, the mission found evidence of localized vitrification, areas of upper crust fused into glassy matrices by sudden high-temperature events. The geologic signatures were not consistent with purely volcanic activity. Instead, their thermal histories, rapid heating to extreme temperatures followed by cooling and shock quenching, matched energy release scenarios in which concentrated power systems vent into the environment. Sediment cores from coastal basins recorded abrupt climate records preserved elsewhere in the planet's strata told a tale of transformation. Pollen-like microfossils disappeared unexpectedly across sedimentary horizons. Carbonate precipitates altered composition. Glacial and aeolian proxies shifted toward regimes of renewed aridity or hyperwetness, depending on latitude. The inscriptions themselves referenced a veil, a term that contextual optics into atmosphere, particulate clouds, aerosol injections, deliberate albedo manipulation perhaps. Whether the veil was an attempted defense against orbital weapons, the notion of an interplanetary war reframed the artifacts of space. What the mission had initially catalogued as infrastructure tethers, platforms, arrays, took on the aspect of contested terrain. The grooves of maintenance, the docking bays, the energy conduits, once neutral catalogues of logistics, now read as lines of supply and contested nodes. Orbital lattices, it seemed, were both shields and targets. A few orbital segments bore impact scars inconsistent with micrometeoroids, patterned perforations concentrated along linear seams, suggesting the narrative that coalesced in briefings was not cinematic. It was granular and awful in its banality. The inscriptions recorded failed contingency plans. If node fails, deploy ballast. If veil persists, ration water. If corridors break, prioritize archive. They recorded bureaucratic attempts to prioritize life support and to move cultural memory into vacuum. There were fragmentary legalese, inventories of materials to be lifted into orbit, lists of artisans and their specialties, evidence of a civilization trying to survive by being deliberate about what to say. Human response to the discovery was layered. There was scientific curiosity, the thrift of methodical hypothesis, the focused delight of fitting congruent pieces of evidence together across disparate datasets. There was institutional anxiety about the implications for risk assessment. If civilizations could weaponize planetary systems, what did that mean for future encounters or for humanity's own energy choices? And there was existential tenderness, an empathetic vertigo when standing before a mural panel or a storage vault, and imagining the people who had once stewarded the arrays, tending their machines as weather chain. The archive carried, too, an implicit warning. The texts did not valorize conquest, they recorded choices about energy that read like a moral calculus gone wrong. Power concentrated for production and survival became concentrated for coercion and destruction. The inscription's tonal inflection shifted across panels, at first pragmatic, later plaintive, finally resigned. A repeated line. Its glyphs clustered with the orientation sign seemed to carry a cultural deepening of the same index. To the sky we entrusted remembrance. The line's repetition across murals and plates read like a cultural refrain, preserve outward. Translation itself proved to be an ethical instrument. Scientists were acutely aware of the dangers of over-reading, scarcity of parallel corpora, absence of unambiguous bilingual keys, and the seductive arc of narrative closure. So every interpretive move was cross-validated by physical proxies, thermal signatures, isotopic anomalies, sedimentary markers, and by the conservatory protocols that had governed earlier excavations. The mission's discourse framed its claims in probabilistic language. These data increased the likelihood of a coordinated. For the broader public, the discovery compressed into evocative images: orbital lattices in ruins, glassy fields of fused crust, murals of ascension, and the recurrent glyph like a punctuation mark across epochs. These images carried cultural freight. Philosophers and historians began to argue not only about causality but about continuity. What does it mean for a species to choose the sky as memory bank? What values does a civilization invest in the things it elevates into vacuum? The inscriptions suggested certain answers: technical knowledge, logistics, and ceremonial acts. Politically, the discovery shifted certain operational priorities. Protection and non-interference protocols grew more elaborate. Decisions about how to preserve the orbital artifacts, whether to attempt active retrieval, and the ethics of exposing caches to analysis became matters of policy as much as science. The glyph, as an orienting sign, became the linchpin around which stewardship strategies were debated. Some advocated for a strict moratorium on physical interference, arguing that context was everything. Others proposed targeted, minimal interventions to prevent further. In the quiet rooms where experts catalogued, analyzed, and debated, a rhetorical refrain kept returning: that the very act of reading these inscriptions was itself an ethical operation. To interpret was to tell a story about agency, culpability, and choice. To translate was to assume a partial stewardship of a past, not one's own. The glyph thus became more than an index. It became a moral hinge. It invited present observers to consider not just what happened, but what choices future generations should make when their technical reach intersects with planet. The narrative remained unfinished. The inscriptions, allied with the geological and material evidence, made a compelling case for a civilization that had escalated energy into planetary-scale conflict, with climate consequences that reshaped habitability. But certainty was withheld. Alternative pathways, catastrophic technological failure, unintended cascade from climate engineering projects, or even cascading natural events exacerbated by human intervention remained on the table. The mission's archive catalogued probabilities and cautions with the last image in the file was not a revelation but a protocol, a map fragment inked in terms that were practical as well as mournful. It marked several orbital nodes with the glyph and appended a short notation repeated across plates and murals: "Remind, do not be quick to burn what you can lift." The injunction read like a residue of cultural memory, a lesson hard learned and inscribed in durable media. It spoke to the impulse that perhaps led this civilization to place its memory in vacuum, a hope that some things could be rescued from the weathering hand of geology. It also carried, in the end, the glyph's sporadic appearance on Earth offered more than an exotic connection. It reframed human questions about survival, stewardship, and the politics of energy. The discovery demanded both humility and a sustained method: patient analysis, cross-disciplinary corroboration, ethical restraint, and an acceptance that some answers will arrive only through long attention. The archive. The plates, the murals, the vitrified fields, the orbital lattice posed a larger question for any species that places its bets on technology and memory. That question is not one the mission could resolve in a single briefing. It unfolded as a continual invitation to listen longer, to corroborate more, and to weigh the moral cost of learning against the moral obligation to protect what one has found. The glyph, small and recurring, remained a quiet compass. It pointed outward to the sky and inward to a set of choices about how a civilization writes itself into the future. The final register in the archive, tender, equivocal, and unignorable, was not a verdict, but a prompt: interpret with care, act with caution, and remember that the trace. What does it mean to find, carved into stone and metal, a sky that points back at the place where the observers themselves stand? The discovery arrived as a quiet technical triumph, a photogrammetric overlay of mural panels and etched plates producing a constellation of marks that, when projected into three-dimensional celestial coordinates, resolved into something disturbingly precise. The carved grids and schematics did not merely evoke star patterns by accident, they encoded positions. When calibrations accounted for stellar proper motion, precession, and the slow wander of interstellar perspective, one particular node in the ancient lattice aligned with a planet whose ephemeris matched Earth. Not in the romantic shorthand of a blur, this realization reframed earlier anomalies. The recurrent glyphs found in terrestrial strata, the small hooked mark that had appeared in bronze-like beads, buried plates, and even in coastal caches were no longer curiosities of convergent symbolism. They functioned as a connective thread running between planetary records, metal plates sealed in an alien vault, murals that pictured ascent into the sky, orbital lattices still humming faint signals, and now star charts that included an unmistakable marker located in the system humans call home. The initial reaction in the mission's logs was not theatrical astonishment, but a sequence of methodical verification. Scientists reran astrometric solutions, pushed the data through independent pipelines, and cross-checked coordinate systems against different catalogs. The maps were not photographic imprints, they were synthetic constructs, layers of projection, annotation, and symbolic shorthand. But when those layers were unwrapped, the same node appeared again and again, embedded in different media and fashioned in different hands across widely separated sites. The recurrence suggested intent. That knowledge raised an even more consequential hypothesis, one that the mission's analysts named cautiously and repeatedly as they compiled mounting evidence: directed panspermia. The phrase carried weighty associations. On one register, it was an observational economy. The builders of the orbital arrays and the curation devices in the vault may have had technological means to move matter and microorganisms, and may have chosen to seed a planet with biochemical agents conducive to life. On another register, it was a narrative that convulsed human origin stories, a possibility that some of the evidence could be marshaled, but it was not of the kind that produces immediate certainties. The murals and plates depicted logistics, ascent, and ritual. The orbital artifacts suggested systems designed to lift and to preserve. In sediment cores from both the exoplanet and from Earth, analysts found anomalous isotopic excursions, small departures from background ratios in elements associated with metabolisms and chemical processing. In certain microfossil beds, molecular residues bore patterns that were statistically unusual, polymers with repeating motifs that matched processing by known industrial. Scientific caution demanded a layered approach. Could the star chart alignment be a projection artifact? An overlaying of cultural motifs onto astronomical patterns interpreted with the bias of a human catalogue? Could isotopic anomalies be the result of convergent biogeochemistry or of later contamination? Could the orbital structures and the mural motifs be independent cultural strategies that happened by complex chance to echo human distributions of life? Each skepticism was addressed with instruments and statistics, temporal triangulations based on stellar movement, comparative isotopic baselines across. The scientific implications were profound. If a technological culture had once placed Earth into its navigational and archival cartography, and if that culture had intentionally moved matter, biological or mineral, into this system, then the boundary between natural and engineered origin narratives for life was no longer a purely terrestrial question. It became an interplanetary one. Evolutionary histories could still hold. Common descent need not be negated, but the initial conditions and catalytic events that set chemical complexity on a pathway to life, beyond academic implications, the discovery carried cultural gravity. The image of a map that includes Earth as a designated node suggested a civilization that had looked outward and intentionally connected its memory to another world. That choice, of cartography and of preservation, spoke to values. The same archive that recorded logistics and monuments also contained funerary imagery and lists of transfer. The recurring motif of ascent figures stepping toward the sky, tethers and corridors, and an urgency painted into processional murals took on immediate interpretive shading. One plausible, yet every line of evidence pushed observers toward more questions. If the builders had visited Earth, when did they come? Astronomical calibrations allowed crude dating. Maps that encoded stellar positions function as historical clocks. The motion of stars is gentle but inexorable. Mapping their configuration backward yielded epochs. The mission's analysts computed ranges, centuries to millions of years, depending on which reference stars were used and on assumptions about the map's frame. Those ranges dovetailed uneasily with the terrestrial archaeological record, glyph-bearing beads and plates in Earth sediments dated to different eras, with evidence converging on the possibility that the ancient architects had known Earth and may have intervened on it. The mission reached an ethical and political bifurcation. The discovery transformed a technical question into a civic one. The core decision loomed: what should be done with this knowledge? Options unfolded logically and morally. One path demanded immediate, wide disclosure, inform public institutions and the peoples of Earth, allow democratic processes to determine response, and invite global participation in deciding the next steps. Transparency argued that withholding such a fundamental shift in human self-understanding would be paternalistic, possibly unjust, and would deprive humanity of agency in shaping its future. A second path argued for strategic restraint. The discovery could be weaponized, misinterpreted, or used as political leverage. Premature or partial disclosure could destabilize social orders, inflame millenarian movements, or provoke geopolitical competition for the artifacts and sites. There were also practical considerations: biological and cultural contamination. If traces of an ancient intervention existed, then any uncalibrated exposure could disturb fragile archives or introduce modern biosphere contaminants that might confound further. A third path combined incremental disclosure with rigorous international governance. It proposed convening an interdisciplinary council, scientists, ethicists, representatives from civil society, and cultural custodians, to evaluate evidence, frame public communications, and outline principles for stewardship and for further research. That approach emphasized procedural justice, decisions made in transparent, deliberative fora, with safeguards against unilateral exploitation. The mission's procedural documents recorded a fourth axis of decision-making: the primacy of preservation. Regardless of disclosure policy, the physical artifacts and the sites required careful custodial protocols. The orbital lattice, the vaults, the murals, and the metal plates were fragile archives. Intervention carried risks. To probe too aggressively might destroy contextual cues essential to interpretation. To remove artifacts could be a form of cultural extraction tantamount to erasure. The mission's ethos, matured across weeks of contact with the exoplanet's materials, now favored minimal intervention. These policy options were more than bureaucratic abstractions. They raised visceral tensions. The record preserved the language of feeling without personal dramatics, a field of gravity, a constricting weight, a moral vertigo. Those phrases described a collective affect rather than individual theatrics. The sort of quiet, sustained pressure that attends the realization that a new fact could rewrite stories communities rely upon. The mission's collective consciousness experienced wonder, dread, responsibility, and an uneasy humility. They had, in one sense, stumbled into a practical steps followed ethicized reasoning. The mission enacted a precautionary quarantine on raw datasets. Replicated images, compressed and annotated, were prepared for controlled release to a pre-selected, multidisciplinary advisory body. Secure channels were opened with earthbound institutions, scientific academies, cultural heritage councils, and international bodies charged with extraterrestrial matters, but with access tiers calibrated to the sensitivity of the material. The mission preserved provenance chains and created immutable digital ledgers for every artifact, establishing an evidentiary record. The decision also encompassed a mandate for extended study. The mission committed to a program of non-destructive investigation, targeted in situ sampling under strict chain of custody rules, and expanded monitoring of the orbital lattice's electromagnetic signatures. A campaign of temporal observation was proposed, seasonal, diurnal, and long-arc studies designed to separate artifactual anomalies from active maintenance behaviors. The mission outlined a plan to develop autonomous probes that could sample remote orbital nodes with minimal disturbance. Devices can, yet alongside technical planning, the mission recognized the unavoidable political dimension. Any engagement with artifacts that might have ties to Earth's past would become a matter of global cultural significance. A private appropriation of orbital components or an unauthorized broadcast could inflame rivalries and strip local communities, the heirs of Earth's cultural heritage, of agency. The mission therefore formalized a temporary moratorium on unilateral retrieval and placed the archives under an emergent international stewardship arrangement pending broader consultation. Philosophically, the choice to act with restraint was not abdication. It was an expression of a particular understanding of time and responsibility. The maps that pointed home had been made by beings who, in their great anxiety or foresight, had attempted to move memory into a domain where geology could not erase it as easily. The present mission recognized a parallel obligation to ensure that the way this information was handled respected the temporality of both the makers and those potentially affected by disclosure. To rush was to arrogate to the present an authority it did not possess. To defer, the mission's decision had the shape of a hinge: secure the archives, expand rigorous study, and convene a transparent representative council to deliberate on disclosure and stewardship. The immediate public headline, "Earth appears on alien star charts," would not be broadcast wholesale. Instead, a tiered release would begin, a technical dossier shared with a vetted international panel, accompanied by a public statement acknowledging intriguing correlations and promising further study. The language of that statement would be calibrated to avoid triumphalism and terror alike. It would be an admission of, in the quiet observatory where the mission's logs accumulated, there was room for a final reflection that was not institutional, but existential. To find oneself the subject of a mark made by another intelligence is to be placed simultaneously as object and question. The engraved sky was a palimpsest of other minds. Maps, if taken seriously, are acts of bearing witness. Whoever drew that node on the map had oriented themselves to Earth in a way that preserved a relation across time. The present observers, small in both scale and tenure, now bore a responsibility to answer that witness with care. The decision adopted by the mission did not conclude the matter. It deferred judgment while expanding inquiry. It placed a premium on patience, replication, and ethical stewardship. It recognized that the true danger was not simply error in interpretation, but the harm done by haste, contamination of archives, cultural dislocation, or the loss of context that would render the past unintelligible. The maps had pointed to a possibility. The world's response would have to be a practice of listening that matched the duration of the questions raised. Deep time continues to be patient. The carved stars will not demand immediacy. But the present is noisy and politicized, and the possibility that a civilization once reached, touched, and perhaps seeded Earth insists that decisions be made not merely by instruments and models, but by a global polity capable of balancing curiosity with custody. The mission's first act of responsibility was therefore to buy time for analysis, for ethical deliberation, and for the slow, communal work of translating astonishment into prudence. The record closed this chapter with a notation of commitment. Further, what does it mean to be a witness whose appointment is abruptly shortened by the very thing one has come to study? The slow-motion violence of a world reasserting its own physics. The question hovered over the operation like a low-frequency tremor, subtle at first and then impossible to ignore. It was not a philosophical exercise, it was a practical constraint that arrived in the form of numbers, rising spectral noise in the low-band seismometers, a sudden enrichment of volatile sulfur species in atmospheric intakes, thermal contours steepening across fault-bounded plateaus. Those numbers, the catalogue of instruments, registered the alteration almost politely at first. An accelerometer reported a variance that lay outside expected microseismic background. An array of shallow-bore seismometers, set like a ring of listening teeth around the plateau, produced a series of waveforms whose low-frequency energy increased in amplitude and coherence. Instruments that had been idling in archive scan mode flicked to high priority. Scripts that had been designed for patient integration now ran in emergency cadence. In milliseconds on the scale of code, they resolved a vector. The planet was breathing differently. That vector carried operational consequence. The mission's emergency matrix, a document that had been refined through decades of contingency planning, assigned a numerical risk score to the constellation of sensor anomalies. Above a certain threshold, the protocol collapsed the luxury of extended fieldwork into triage. What could be gathered now, with the least disturbance and highest return of interpretive value? What would be left behind to be read in the future, perhaps by others with different time to sit and translate? The calculus was technical and ethical in equal measure. The machine read the hazard alert. The first task was to preserve the maximum amount of evidence with the minimum amount of footprint. Non-destructive sensing intensified. Aerial drones swept tighter grids, their LiDAR pings now a staccato urgency. Hyperspectral cameras lengthened exposures to improve signal-to-noise ratios, polarimetric channels were prioritized to tease apart engineered surface treatments from altered mineral varnish. Passive sensing gave what it could, active probes were deployed only when their use was ethically justified by their likely return. When intrusive sampling became unavoidable, the choreography was surgical. Automated corers, compact, self-stabilizing, designed to minimize local vibration, lowered on tethers to the plateau's sediment basins. They tapped the earth with metered impulse, rotating and drawing centimeter-scale cores that were then chilled and sealed in nested containment. Each core carried with it a universe of potential stories, laminations of microbial mats, isotopic fingerprints of ancient hydrology, the microstratigraphy of ash layers that could be aligned with distant radiometric events. There was a ritual to these acts that the logs recorded with a kind of respectful dryness. Metadata accompanied every sample like a passport, GPS coordinates precise to submeter accuracy, orientation relative to the nearest orbital node as recorded in the recovered maps, a timestamp synchronized with the mission's master clock, a description of contextual features, and a probabilistic ranking of the sample's expected yield. The aim was to create a record whose fidelity would survive the mischief of time. The mission had learned that context could be more informative than content, a small fragment disconnected from triage, however, does not eliminate feeling. The atmosphere within the mission apparatus, never a single person but a distributed temperament, tightened. There was a consolidated sorrow that had a professional edge to it, the knowledge of items left undone, corridors not mapped at sufficient resolution, pockets of the city whose murals would be buried again if tectonics accelerated. Alongside that sorrow, there was a practical, almost fierce exhilaration. Time pressure sharpened perception, choices had to be made quickly, and that compression sometimes reveals patterns that drawn-out study can graze over without seeing. The records kept a few terse exchanges. Protocol fragments that read like small prayers to procedure. One log entry, transmitted as a standard form alert, read seismic coherence rising. Triage mode 3. Prioritized non-destructive survey. Deliver samples AF to orbital quarantine. Another entry noted, with structural calm, thermal frontier migrating east. Possible dike inflation. Recommend seismic ring retrieval and immediate ascent. These were not dramatic dialogues, they were the voice of stewardship. Decisions recorded to be judged. Collecting the artifacts and organics involved miniatures of effort, each expanded in detail to maximize the future legibility of what remained. A dedicated robotics arm the size of a human forearm and designed for micromanipulation approached an engraved stone slab with motions mapped in high fidelity to a saved rehearsal. Grippers that had been designed to mimic delicate human touch closed with incremental forces so as not to crack mineral varnish that, under spectrometry, held molecular traces of binders. When a microfissure did split beneath an older mounting, a reminder that even the most cautious actions can create change. The approach to biological sampling was even more conservative. Knowing the risk of contamination and the ethical inflection around potential biospheres, the mission had long ago embraced a precautionary principle that favored remote sequencing over invasive assays. On-site sequencing hardware miniaturized high-fidelity devices capable of reading nucleic acids and molecular polymers, sampled environmental DNA from dust and biofilms, producing preliminary taxonomic hints encoded as probability matrices rather than definitive species lists. The results were packaged into encrypted bundles to be analyzed in time compressed as geological signals magnified. The seismometer ring's bandwidth increased not only in amplitude but in frequency content. What had been microtremors began to develop discrete emergent pulses. Surface temperatures along a volcanic rift rose between cycles, and a satellite-fed thermal camera showed the emergence of a narrow linear hotspot moving progressively toward the plateau's rim. Gas sensors in a low-lying basin recorded pulses of methane and sulfur dioxide, their molar ratio shifting in ways consistent with new magmatic intrusion. Each incremental change added to the risk profile. The mission's ethical deliberations were pragmatic but charged. There were questions of cultural property implicit in every act. Some of the most spectacular artifacts lay in ravines that would soon be buried or torn apart by emergent faulting. Removing them might preserve objects, but it would remove them from their context, an irreversible act of cultural extraction. The mission's policy favored leaving markers. Where objects were left in situ, small, physically inert markers were installed, coded beacons that recorded position, context, and a high-fidelity 3D holograph of the object. There was also a modest act of testimony that reflected the mission's reflex toward humility. In a sealed capsule left on a terrace, a neutral blank object produced from institutional stores, there was deposited a curated archive. It contained digital facsimiles of the most fragile murals, spectral datasets of materials, the high-resolution maps recovered from the building's internal devices, and a carefully worded statement of intent written in multiple symbolic languages, ones designed to be preserved in the same enduring media that the vanished civilization had themselves used. The message was, the planet did not wait for complex narratives. The first macroscopic event was sudden, but not instantaneous in cosmic terms, a localized uplift that registered as a step change in displacement across a mapped fault. Instruments captured a rising harmonic of ground motion, a pattern that signaled dike intrusion rather than slow creep. Dust plumes began to lift in thin curtains, catching the planet's purple light and scattering it into a living stain across the horizon. The drones, already instructed to retreat to safe stances, should particulate. Loading exceeds set threshold. The departure sequence was enacted as a rehearsed animal reflex. Engines warned on command sequences designed to minimize local atmospheric disturbance. Trajectory algorithms recalculated ascent vectors that avoided freshly mobilized ejector. The ascent itself, while momentarily tense, proceeded under the steady choreography of long training and 1,000 rehearsed contingencies. The lander's legs retracted, barely churning the top thin layer of dust, and the craft rose through a curtain of plume-smeared light. Below, the plateau contracted into a mosaic of shadows and glints. Even as the ship rose, sensors recorded further changes. Thermal hotspots flared and coalesced into a linear chain, Seismic waveforms evolved from harmonic to impulsive, their energy spreading outward in a widening fan. Orbital assets that had been catalogued as possibly dormant, some still emitting faint telemetry, experienced load changes, station-keeping adjustments registered in the lattice as if the planet's altered atmosphere now pushed unpredictably against the orbiting network. The artifacts that had been durable in vacuum were not immune to rapid planetary change. The interaction between ground in the relative safety of orbital space, the mission did not exhale so much as recompose its attention. The collected samples were transferred through locked hatches into quarantined labs whose sterile fields could be managed and monitored. The initial sequencing data, the mineralogical spectra, the high-fidelity images, the cartographic overlays, each became shards in an integrative effort that would take months, years, perhaps longer to interpret. There was elation at what had been retrieved and a sober accounting of what remained inaccessible. The planet, with its renewed geological urgency, had refused a slow, yet snapshots can be unexpectedly rich. The cores contained layered bands whose rhythmic patterning hinted at ecological cycles now interrupted. Organic residues suggested metabolic pathways that, when framed against isotopic anomalies, raised new questions about the interplay of engineered systems and local biochemistry. The orbital array's intermittent emissions, previously inscrutable, had adjusted their cadence after the onset of ground events in a way that suggested automated maintenance protocols responding to atmospheric change. The dataset was emotion in the aftermath was a communal qualia registered across the mission's various logs and internal briefings. The archive recorded moods rather than monologues, a field of melancholy for what had been left, a steady professional pride at the quality of stewardship, an anxious curiosity about what the long-term transformations would mean for the orbital artifacts, and a modest but sharp sense of humility before the scale of deep time. The mission's rhetoric shifted subtly from that of discoverer to that of custodian. Language in the logs grew cautious. At a meta level, the episode reframed prior hypotheses. The choice by the vanished people. If they were the makers of the orbital lattice and the inscribed plates, to lift some of their material culture into the vacuum had been understood as an act of foresight. The planet's present agitation complicated that narrative. Archival strategies that choose vacuum as sanctuary gain longevity against geological erosion, but remain susceptible to anthropogenic or planetary perturbations that operate on different timescales. The mission's intervention. To remove select items, to photograph, there was a tacit promise written into the mission's closing records. The departure was not a severing, but a postponement. The mission would not claim that it had understood all that it had seen. Instead, it pledged to return, to develop more nuanced models of the planet's tectonic architecture, to refine low-impact sampling methods, and to expand ethical protocols that balanced knowledge with conservation. The pledge was technical and moral at once. The work of listening across deep time required the patience to restrain immediate consumption and the humility to admit that some stories, as the craft receded and groundfall became a diminishing mosaic, the planet continued its slow motion. Ridges bowed, steams hissed in the distance, and the purple dome of the sky shifted in hue as particulate layers thickened. Below, the sealed markers and the capsule of digital testimony sat like a promise on the plateau, an offering that admitted both human vulnerability and the desire to be a faithful witness. Above, the orbiting array, some modules wobbling under new drag regimes, continued to blink in low-level pulses. The planet's story kept unfolding on a timescale that would outlast any. In the mission's archive, the scene was distilled into a sober set of entries, data sets catalogued, samples sealed, markers placed, and a timetable for return drafted in conditional language. The mission recorded what it could not take, entire districts of the city still unread, subsurface archives unreachable, pockets of stabilized vitrification that evaporation might soon swallow. Those lacunae were not failures in the narrative, but the terms of a shared ethic. Some things must be left for a later stewardship that will be measured by patience rather than immediacy. The final thought in the file was not a conclusion, but a question posed to the future, in the same manner. The mission had been posed to the present. If memory can be lifted into vacuum and preserved against erosion, what responsibilities do those who find it now owe to that memory? The planet had granted only a hurried audience. The mission had answered with as much care as time permitted, mindful that to be a steward in deep time is to practice the restraint of leaving traces as intact as possible for those who might come later to read them. The departure was an act of custody, a promise to return, a refusal to claim. What does it mean to carry a planet's silence away? That question framed the final hours of the operation like an invisible instrument, readout, quiet, persistent, and impossible to ignore. The mission's architecture had always been designed around gradients of time, the immediate tick of system checks, the medium-term cadence of observation campaigns, and the long sweep of archival thinking that imagined knowledge outliving those who made it. Now, as the craft prepared to depart, those gradients compressed into one distilled judgment: how to leave as much as possible intact, to take only what would make meaning. The departure itself was a choreography of restraint. Every movement had been rehearsed, each micro-decision cross-linked to ethical matrices and technical contingencies. High-bandwidth telemetry streamed the final suites of images and spectral archives into immutable ledgers. Photonic imprints of murals, laser-scanned topography of plazas and canals, three-dimensional reliefs of carved faces and tool marks. These were duplicated into read-only stores sequestered in radiation, hardened memory, and mirrored across redundant nodes in the ship's vault. Samples already sealed in nested containment were hermetically. Sensors continued to monitor the planet as the ascent profile unfolded. Cameras watched the plateau withdraw beneath an expanding vista, recording the purple atmospheric veil as it softened into a thin band. Thermal maps that had been set to long integration times took an extra few exposures to capture diurnal variance in the canals. Spectrometers lingered on anomalous emission lines in the orbital lattice until signal-to-noise thresholds could no longer be improved without committing to dangerously long station keeping. Even in the act of leaving, the mission collected. Departure was not abandonment, it was a last. There is a particular quality to the feeling of leaving a place that has both been found and guarded. A compound of sorrow and duty that manifests less as theatrical grief and more like an institutional constriction. The logs recorded it as a cluster of measures, a higher-than-normal incidence of maintenance checks called for by crews who otherwise did not falter. Long stretches of silence between routine exchanges where the human tendency to narrate dwindled in favor of listening, an increase in redundant imaging as if multiplicity itself were a moral precaution. When the last stage thrusters fired and the world receded, its features resolved into a tiled memory, plazas and canals sealed in photonic mosaics, a sleeping city mapped to millimeter precision, vaults of metal plates catalogued as potential lexicons, and the soft blue glow of interior devices documented in hyperspectral slices. The orbital lattice, those angular scars and engineered seams that had once seemed simply utilitarian, was recorded as a network of nodes with time-stamped telemetry traces. The glyph that had recurred across continents and planets was isolated. The final datasets were not merely deposits of curiosity. They were legalistic acts, designed for future adjudication. Provenance metadata accompanied each file, each physical sample, and each three-dimensional capture, chain of custody logs, contextual descriptors, and layered confidence metrics. These records were constructed to later answer hard questions. Who had touched a sample? In what order? What algorithms had processed a map? Which models had produced a reconstruction of a mural image? The mission treated epistemic transparency as an ethical obligation. That sense of duty extended beyond preservation into a careful, almost ritualized abstention. Markers were left in place, small, passive beacons encoded with the archive's coordinates, and a readable index for future visitors, intended to act as locators rather than claims. These markers were designed with an explicit constraint: they would not alter the site's material state beyond a minimal footprint. The ethical calculus that informed this choice had been hammered out over the months of fieldwork. Preservation of context was worth more than the retrieval of any single artifact. The integrity of an Even as instruments fed their final packets of data into the ship's protected stores, the interpretive work continued. Analysts back in orbital labs layered maps with stratigraphic profiles and bolted isotopic curves against radiometric anchors. The recurrent glyph gained new weight as correlations multiplied. What had once been a puzzling symbol now appeared across strata and sites with an emergent coherence. Statistical models that had remained conservative were forced to increase their posterior probability estimates for several hypotheses: that the glyph served as an index linking ground to sky, that the orbital lattice, the timelines that emerged were uncomfortably broad. Astronomical precession embedded in the maps offered ranges that spanned orders of magnitude, spanning human-scale centuries to planetary-scale millennia. Geochemical data from vitrified crusts and sudden isotopic excursions suggested punctuated events, rapid heat releases, abrupt changes in atmospheric chemistry that aligned poorly with smooth models of slow decline. In short, the planet's record resisted tidy closure. For every hard bracket, there was a margin of uncertainty. That uncertainty was not a failing of science, so much as a property of deep time, which returns the narrative to the central, inevitable thought: perhaps they left millions of years ago. It is a framing both brutal and generous. Brutal because the idea of millions of years collapses the human scale into near invisibility. The lifespans, the polities, the everyday intimacies that science and archaeology crave become ephemeral shadows. Generous because it preserves the dignity of those who chose to lift memory into vacuum. The longer the timescale, the more deliberate the act of preservation appears. The photographic textures recorded in the murals, the careful metallurgical choices in the plates, and the design of devices that pulsed with slow-maintenance signatures are all consistent with a species that thought in durations. That wager carried moral lessons. In designing artifacts for longevity, the vanished civilization demonstrated an understanding of material media that was at once technical and cultural. Orbital archives and metal plates were not merely repositories. They were choices about future readers. Their creators made bets on where memory would best persist, choosing vacuum over the grinding of tectonics and the dissolving chemistry of atmospheres. Yet the mission's work revealed the incompleteness of that strategy. Vacuum preserved form. It did not insulate against the deeper complications of energy politics, automated decay, or the chaos of intervention. This realization reframed the mission's reflexive comparison to Earth. The documents and materials left behind, maps, plates, murals, were not merely evidence of another society's techniques. They were moral documents too, instructive about the kinds of choices large-scale technosocial systems make. They pointed at an uncomfortable mirror, a civilization that attempted to outwit geological time by building in the sky, but that nonetheless found itself vulnerable to the dynamics of energy and conflict. There is a lesson here, quietly apprehensive, for any species with the capability to alter. Yet the more immediate moral was practical and humble. The archive left in the ship's stores was prepared not to announce verdicts, but to enable listening. The mission's leadership, understood as an institutional ethos rather than a cast of characters, had codified an approach, released data gradually, subject findings to rigorous peer review, and create an inclusive, deliberative mechanism for public disclosure. The aim was not to hide, but to avoid precipitate narratives that could distort both the evidence and its cultural consequences. The planet had offered a conversation across deep time. The present, noise. What will future civilizations find when they come upon these traces? That is the question that the mission archived most carefully. It catalogued scenarios: passive discovery, intentional excavation, accidental contamination, and for each scenario recorded ethical recommendations. If a future visiting party is scientifically capable but culturally unprepared, the mission urged restraint, preserve context, replicate data, and prioritize non-invasive study. If a future public learns early and demands rapid action, the mission on a quieter register, the mission recorded a small set of acts meant as gestures for any future finders. The sealed capsule left on the plateau contained not grand claims but documentary humility, the archived photogrammetry, a catalogue of sampling actions taken, a statement of intent regarding non-interference, and an encoded index to the larger distributed dataset. It was neither trophy nor claim. It was a promise to return and an invitation to participate in a conversation about what to do next. The gesture was intentionally unostentatious, a catalogue rather than a proclamation. Metadata. As the planet dropped below the ship's horizon, its radar signature dwindled into a faint scattering of echoes. There is a technical richness to that visual. On radar screens, continents bleed into noise, coastlines smear, and orbital debris resolves only as a persistent set of blips. The mission's last recorded image was of that fade, a composite of radar returns overlaid with the photometric mosaic. In the metadata appended to that image was a brief reflection. The trace of presence had been documented. Interpretive work would continue in the slower arena. There is a final, necessary humility to what was left unsaid. The mission's archive could not answer the intimate why. Why did they choose to leave their artifacts in orbit? Why did their systems fail? Why did conflict or catastrophe unfold when it did? The available evidence offered frameworks and probabilities, not certain biographies. The murals and plates are eloquent and mute at once. They record gestures, processions, transfers, lists, and tally marks that hint at choices and priorities, but they do not deliver the interior deliberations of minds. To imagine those minds with human detail would be an interpret. If there is a single image that closes the mission's long dossier, it is modest and sharp. The ship recedes into the darkening web of deep space. The planet shrinks on the radar until it is a band of noise. The archival beacons left in place blink on slow cycles, and the sealed data vaults carry a set of files that future minds will decode, contest, and reinterpret. Across that final frame, the unseen actors, the creators of the murals, the smiths who engraved the metal plates, the architects of orbital arrays, remain distant. Perhaps they departed in panic. There is another image, quieter and perhaps more lasting. The planet as a palimpsest, layers of labor and loss overlaid like paper thin as dust. In that image, the orbited platforms, the sealed plates, and the carved faces endure as traces left in defiance of geological erasure. They are not proof of immortality, only of persistence. They are invitations cast outward for other intelligences. If any will ever be present, to find, to read, and to decide what to do with what they discover. Perhaps they left millions of years before. Perhaps their departure, like so many human actions, was a mixture of foresight and error, of preservation and hubris. The certainty was small, the possibilities large. What the mission returned with was not a tidy solution, but a collection of testimonies, material, chemical, cartographic, and ethical. Those testimonies will be sifted by many hands, scientists, philosophers, custodians, and publics, whose debates will echo across time in the same way those original choices had echoed forward. As the radar trace thinned and the planet's image resolved into the galaxy's faint background, one thought remained steady in the mission's final log: traces outlive their makers. They wait. They record. They offer themselves to whoever will read them. The planet, its orbital lattice, and the scattered markers of culture had become a quiet cache of questions for the future, an archive arranged in stone, metal, light, and silence. The craft turned away. its course set for other tasks, carrying with it copies of what it had seen and a promise to return. Maybe they left millions of years ago. Maybe what remained was only the deliberate residue of memory. But whatever their timing, their traces were still here. Inscriptions in dust and alloy, emblems on walls, beacons in vacuum, waiting for another civilization at some other moment to find them and to ask, as the mission had asked, what it means to remember across the slow, indifferent geometry of the stars.